In the fall of 1994, a 52-year-old woman pulled into the driveway of her home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and then turned her car off. As she sat there for a minute chatting with her daughter on the phone, she was suddenly startled by someone running up and knocking on her car window. When she turned to see who it was, she saw this big guy standing in her driveway who she didn't recognize. But when she rolled the window down just a couple of inches and this guy was able to explain why he was there, the woman relaxed, and then she got out of the car, she shut the door behind her, and she led this guy into her home. That man would later be dubbed the Bathroom Man, and he was there to do something horrific to that woman. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please bring the 5-star review button to the movies with you, but instead of giving them popcorn, give them butter-covered styrofoam. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was another beautiful day in late October 1994. The afternoon air was cool and the sky above the town of Voorhees was a soft, clear blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. As 52-year-old Carol Newlander stepped out the door of Classic Cakes Bakery onto the sidewalk, she stopped for a minute and tilted her face upward to enjoy the feel of the light breeze and sunshine. With her eyes closed, she could forget for a few seconds that she was standing in a strip mall in northern New Jersey surrounded by parking lots, and that pretty soon she'd be joining the hundreds of other drivers on the crowded highway that led south from Voorhees to Carol's home in neighboring Cherry Hill. Carol let out her breath and opened her eyes. She and her husband, Rabbi Fred Newlander, did not actually mind the commercial sprawl that had spread out around them since they had arrived in Cherry Hill 20 years ago. That was when Fred had gotten his first job as assistant rabbi at a Jewish synagogue in Cherry Hill named Emmanuel Temple. A rabbi is a spiritual leader and religious teacher of a Jewish community or congregation. In the 2 decades since their arrival, as Cherry Hill's population grew, so had the Jewish community that now made up almost a third of Cherry Hill's 70,000 residents. Many in that community were ethnic Jews, people who can trace their ancestry back to the land of Israel, and others were non-ethnic Jews who had converted to Judaism. And just a few years after taking that job as assistant rabbi at Emmanuel Temple, Fred had gone on to found his own synagogue named Makor Shalom, which is Hebrew for source of peace. Central to Judaism is the belief in one God who revealed himself through ancient prophets. But Fred's new synagogue also focused on adapting the 3,800-year-old religion to the social and cultural conditions of the modern world. And Fred's gamble had paid off big time. By 1994, Makor Shalom had grown from a few families meeting in members' houses into the largest Jewish temple in Cherry Hill, with a congregation of almost 4,000 members. And Fred and Carol had moved from their small apartment to a comfortable 4-bedroom colonial house in one of the many subdivisions that had slowly but surely nibbled away at what had once been Cherry Hill's rolling farmland. But during those years, Fred was not the only one finding success. The last 2 decades had also been very good to Carol. She and Fred had had 1 daughter and 2 sons, and all 3 children were now either working or going to college or medical school. And 10 years ago, as Fred was busy building his congregation, Carol had decided to pursue her own dream. Working right out of her kitchen in their home at 204 Highgate Lane, Carol had poured her boundless energy into starting a business baking kosher cakes and selling them to local restaurants. With such a large Jewish community in Cherry Hill, Carol had recognized that there was an unmet demand among that group of customers for cakes and sweets that met strict Jewish dietary guidelines. And it would turn out the Gentile, non-Jewish residents of Cherry Hill were just as enthusiastic about Carol's cakes and cookies as the Jewish population was. So before long, what had started out as first Carol then a handful of close friends making cakes in their ovens at home, had grown into Classic Cakes Company, with 2 large retail stores, one in nearby Audubon, and the other right there where Carol was standing, at the Eagle Plaza shopping center in Voorhees. Now, Classic Cakes employed close to 50 people, and combined sales from both bakeries easily topped $10,000 a day. And now, Carol thought to herself as she shouldered her purse and turned toward her own car out there in the parking lot, it was time to get on to the second half of her workday. It was Tuesday, October 25th, and on every Tuesday in the late afternoon, Carol and the other managers of Classic Cakes got together for their weekly business meeting in Cherry Hill, at the home of the company's director of human resources. It was a meeting that often lasted as long as 3 hours. But as Carol walked over to her dark Toyota Camry out in the strip mall parking lot, opening the car door and slipping into the driver's seat, that sense of peace she had felt when she had looked up at the sky a few minutes earlier had left her. In its place was a sense of uneasiness. It had to do with her husband, Fred, and the 6-month sabbatical that he had taken at the beginning of this year. A sabbatical is an extended paid leave period that gives an employee a chance to travel and study. And in Fred's case, the other staff at his synagogue had basically encouraged him to take this sabbatical, almost like it was a reward for all the hard work managing such a big congregation. And Fred had been excited about this sabbatical, but instead of using it to travel or study like most people do, Fred just used the time to grow out his thinning gray hair into a long ponytail, and then just kind of hung around the house in Cherry Hill and at his synagogue, Makor Shalom. Over the last 10 months, her husband had also become increasingly critical of his assistant rabbi, and to Carol, even after his sabbatical period had ended, Fred had seemed very distracted and preoccupied. Now, as Carol drove her car out of the Eagle Plaza parking lot and headed towards Route 70, she tried to reassure herself that Fred's change in behavior couldn't possibly have anything to do with their marriage. After all, they'd been together for almost 30 years, and during that time, Carol had come to know and cherish the qualities that made her and Fred such a strong couple. Where Fred was charismatic and bold, Carol was practical, warm, and good at listening to people. While Fred inspired people, Carol had a knack for making them feel like she was a trusted member of their family. And even though they had come from such different backgrounds, Carol and Fred had formed a loving and productive partnership. Carol, who had been born to wealthy parents, had grown up on the ocean side of New York in a big house with grounds that rolled down to the shore of Hewlett Bay. Fred, who was 1 year older than Carol, was the only child of immigrants who had grown up in the blue-collar section of Queens, New York, where his father had run a struggling dry cleaning business and his mother had stayed home to take care of Fred. Carol and Fred had met on a blind date when they were both in college. Fred was studying religion at Trinity University in Connecticut, and Carol was studying psychology at an exclusive women's college in Massachusetts. Carol, who was small and elegant with auburn-colored hair, intelligent dark eyes, and great taste in clothes and jewelry, was instantly attracted to Fred, whose physical strength and rugged good looks made him seem much taller than his 5 feet 4 inch tall frame. The attraction was 100% mutual. The two of them got married in 1965, moved to Queens, where Fred was later ordained as a rabbi, and by 1971, Cherry Hill, New Jersey would become the Newlanders' permanent home. And while Carol knew that the passage of the years and the daily routines of everyday life were bound to take the edge off the passion and romance that had brought her and Fred together 3 decades earlier, but she still felt that same attraction to Fred, and she knew that he felt the same way about her. Besides, in less than a week, they'd have some much-needed time to spend together when they headed up to New York this Saturday, October 29th, to visit some relatives. With this comforting thought in mind, Carol dragged her thoughts back to the work ahead of her. And by 4 p.m., after stopping on her way to run a couple of errands, Carol pulled into the driveway of the house where she would meet with her management team. A few hours later, Carol was once again back in her Toyota Camry, but even now her workday was not quite finished. Because it had become Carol's habit that several days a week, she would take home that day's cash from both of her bakery branches, and then she would count the money right at her dining room table. Then, the next morning, she could just deposit the cash at the bank first thing. And while Carol thought this was an efficient and convenient way of doing things, Fred thought it was totally reckless, and he hated that she brought all that money home. Even though Carol kept telling Fred that no one outside of her management circle knew that she sometimes traveled with anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 in cash tucked into her burgundy wallet at the bottom of her handbag, Fred told her that all of her bakery employees must see her walk out of the store with all that cash, and so he thought Carol was just asking to get robbed. But Carol had always waved off his concerns, saying that her employees were highly vetted and would never do that to her. And where they lived, Cherry Hill, was known as a very safe and quiet neighborhood. And so Carol told Fred that, no one's ever going to break in and try to steal from them. After getting the cash from both of her bakery locations and hopping back into her car to make the ride back home, Carol glanced at her watch and saw that she still had time to call her 24-year-old daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca was married and a hospital administrator in Philadelphia. Carol had always been very close with Rebecca, and so she cherished these daily phone calls with her. So as Carol drove along, she picked up her car phone, she dialed Rebecca's number, and a few minutes later, she and her daughter were chatting happily about the day's events. Carol was still on the phone when she pulled into her driveway at 204 Highgate Lane. But before she could wrap up the call with Rebecca, Carol was suddenly startled by a loud knock on her car window right next to her head. After nearly dropping her phone, Carol turned and looked outside and saw this huge man standing there right in her driveway. Seeing the look of alarm on Carol's face, the stranger stepped back and put his hands up in the air reassuringly. Carol told Rebecca, who was now asking, what's going on, to just hang on for a minute, that someone was here, and then Carol rolled her window down just a few inches and asked what this guy wanted. And the man in the driveway apologized for startling Carol, and then told her he was just there to see the rabbi and to deliver a package to him. Instantly, Carol could feel herself relax. She had been a rabbi's wife long enough that she'd come to expect visits from members of his congregation for all kinds of reasons and at all kinds of hours, day and night. Rolling the car window down the rest of the way, Carol smiled at the visitor and gestured toward the darkened house. She told him that the rabbi was not home yet, but the man was welcome to come inside and wait and deliver the package in person. After hearing bits of this conversation her mother had just had with this unexpected visitor, Rebecca felt concerned, and when her mom put the phone back to her ear, Rebecca asked her to please give a call once this guy has left so Rebecca would know that her mom was okay. Carol agreed and then ended the call with Rebecca, and then Carol got out of her car, she shut the door behind her, and began walking toward her house with the visitor walking right behind her. Carol had left her handbag filled with all the money in her car trunk. She would come out later when her visitor had left to bring it inside. But for now, Carol led the way to the front door, and when she got there, she unlocked it and gestured for her visitor to step into the small, warm entrance. But once the visitor was inside, the man began acting strange, glancing quickly left and right at the living room and dining rooms on either side of him and Carol. Then he began shifting his weight from one foot to another, and then suddenly, kind of awkwardly, he blurted out to Carol, can I just use your bathroom for a minute? Sensing what she took to be his embarrassment at having to make this request, Carol just smiled and said, of course, and directed him through the kitchen to the first floor bathroom at the back of the house. And then Carol walked back to the front of the house. When the man returned a few minutes later, Carol was standing near the front door looking through the mail that had been delivered that day, and she told the visitor that he was welcome to take a seat in the living room. But the big man just thanked her, said he was sorry for bothering her, and just handed Carol a plain white envelope and asked if she could give it to the rabbi. And then the visitor reached his hand out to open the front door. Meanwhile, almost without thinking, Carol, who had been going through the mail, when she was handed this envelope, she just opened it right away. And when she saw its contents, which was nothing, it was an empty envelope, she put her hand out and stopped this guy and said, hey, wait a minute, it's empty. Did you give me the right one? The man looked startled and then told Carol he must have made a mistake and he picked up the wrong envelope earlier to bring by, and so he'd just have to come by another time. And then, without waiting to hear what Carol had to say, this man very quickly left the house and disappeared into the darkness. Back inside the house, Carol just tore up the empty envelope and dropped it into the wastebasket. Then she picked up the cordless landline phone and dialed Rebecca to tell her daughter that she didn't need to worry, that the man was gone. And as Carol told her daughter about this guy, she laughed and smiled to herself as she described how he came in and just used the bathroom, gave her an empty envelope, and then ran away. It was just another day in the life of a rabbi's wife. An odd but funny story that Carol would tell friends a couple of times in the following couple of days before forgetting all about it. But exactly 1 week later, both Carol and her daughter, Rebecca, would find themselves remembering that strange encounter all too well. Not long after 8 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, November 1st, 1994, Carol was once again arriving at her home on Highgate Lane after having left the weekly Classic Cakes business meeting. The weekend trip she and Fred had just taken to New York had not gone at all the way Carol had hoped. And now, as she pulled her car into the driveway and looked at her darkened house, she told herself that the dissatisfaction that her husband had told her he felt in their marriage was just the result of a late midlife crisis. It had all come out during a big argument they had had on their way home from New York that past Sunday, and Carol was still feeling really hurt and angry. By Monday night, both Carol and Fred had calmed down and agreed that they would go to both separate and joint marriage counseling sessions. They had also talked to each other about cutting back on some of the activities that over the years had drawn them into almost separate lives, Fred's religious duties and Carol's business. But Carol was still upset and shaken, and as she parked her car, turned off the engine, grabbed her purse, and then walked through a swirl of fallen leaves to the house, all she wanted was to get inside and call her daughter Rebecca. Carol knew that hearing her daughter's voice, maybe planning a shopping trip together next weekend, would put Carol in a happier frame of mind. And sure enough, a few minutes later, when Carol heard her daughter pick up the phone and say hello, Carol's spirits lifted. With a sigh of relief, Carol kicked off her shoes in the front hall and then settled in for a nice long chat. But only partway through their call, at around 8:30 p.m., Carol was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Carrying the cordless phone with her, Carol walked to the entryway and peered out the big oval stained glass window in the center of the door. Even through the colored glass, Carol recognized her visitor right away. It was the same huge guy who had stopped by last Tuesday with the empty envelope. Carol swung the door open, and even before the man had time to say, "Hey, it's me again," Carol had invited him inside. She assumed that he was there to see the rabbi again, or maybe this time deliver an envelope that actually had something inside of it. As the man stepped inside, Carol very quietly whispered into the phone to her daughter that her visitor was the bathroom man again. Then Carol turned to her visitor and said she'd be off the phone in a minute, and for now he should just make himself comfortable in the living room. A minute later, Carol wrapped up her call with her daughter, and she put the cordless phone down on a wooden bench in the entryway. And then when she turned around, she was surprised to see her visitor, the bathroom man, had still not moved to the living room. He was still just standing right in front of the front door. Carol let out a quiet sigh, thinking to herself this man was still just as awkward now as he had been the last time they had met. But Carol's years of practice as a hostess kicked in, and she made herself smile. And stepping in front of her visitor, Carol invited the man to follow her deeper into the house. But Carol had only taken 1 or 2 steps away from him when she suddenly felt a big hand grab her left shoulder. And then, before Carol could turn around or even understand what was happening, she felt an explosion of pain as something smashed into the back of her head. The blow was so hard it knocked Carol's glasses off of her face and sent her staggering into the middle of the living room. Then, all at once, she felt a powerful shove to the middle of her back, and then she fell to her knees. A moment later, blood streaming down the sides of her face and into her ears, Carol collapsed onto the white carpet. Later, when the bathroom man looked inside of Carol's burgundy-colored wallet he had taken from her home, he couldn't believe his eyes. He'd been expecting to see thousands of dollars. Instead, he pulled out a grand total of $150. That day had been one of the rare days that Carol had decided not to bring home the cash from that day's sales at the 2 Classic Cakes locations. Meanwhile, at Temple Makor Shalom, located just a few minutes away from Highgate Lane, Rabbi Fred Newlander was finding it almost impossible to end the workday and get home. He'd had to check in on the weekly Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that was going on in one of the conference rooms, and he'd also sat in on choir rehearsal and one of the Jewish study classes taught by his assistant rabbi. He had checked in with Carol earlier that afternoon by phone before her business meeting. Since their argument on Sunday, their conversations had felt strained. Trying to ignore the frosty tone in his wife's voice, Fred had told her that he was probably going to be late that night, but at around 6 p.m. he did plan to go back to their house and have dinner with their son Matthew, but then he'd be leaving again and he wouldn't see her again until late. 20-year-old Matthew was a first-year medical student now at nearby Rutgers University, but he was still working part-time as an emergency medical technician with the Cherry Hill Fire Department. He lived at home with his parents, Carol and Fred, but between his classes and his 12-hour EMT shifts, his parents did not actually see much of him. Finally, just after 9 p.m. that night, Fred stepped out the door of Makor Shalom into the cool, cloudy November night. Like his wife Carol, Fred had also been thinking a lot about all the two of them had built and made together over the past nearly 3 decades. He knew his son Matt had overheard him and Carol arguing after they got home from their weekend trip to New York, and he also knew that Matt had wanted to talk to him over their dinner earlier that evening about what was going on with his parents. But his marriage was just not something Fred wanted to discuss with his children, and so he had pointedly turned the conversation in another direction every time Matt tried to talk about it. Now, 15 minutes after leaving the temple, Fred pulled his car into the driveway of 204 Highgate Lane. The lights were on in the house, and Carol's car was in its usual place. A minute later, at 9:20 p.m., Fred was at the front door of his house, and when he tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, he found it was unlocked. Fred shook his head at the lack of security, thinking about all that money Carol might be counting right now at the dining room table. Once the door was open, Fred expected to hear his wife immediately call out to see if that was him, but instead, the house seemed unusually still and quiet. And then, as Fred stepped inside the house, he saw Carol's feet just visible in the entrance to their living room. No shoes, just socks. A few more steps forward, and what Fred saw on the floor and walls and ceiling of the living room was so shocking that for a moment he was sure he was going to pass out. Struggling to make sense of the scene in front of him, Fred slowly started backing up and reaching out blindly behind him for the cordless phone that Carol had left in the entryway just an hour earlier. 2 minutes later, at 9:22 p.m., the dispatcher at the Cherry Hill Police Department picked up an incoming 911 call. The man's voice at the other end of the line sounded like it was being dragged out of him. "My wife is on the floor and there's blood all over." But a minute later, that same man's voice had sharpened into something closer to a scream. Standing in his front hallway talking to 911, Fred realized that his son Matthew was probably hearing this 911 call right now, and that Matt, being an EMT, might be among the medical personnel that were now being rushed to the Newlander family home. The last of his composure crumbled, and Fred began begging the 911 operator not to let his son anywhere near his house. He could not let his son see his mother the way she was. 7 minutes later, Highgate Lane was crowded with police cars and emergency vehicles. Matt had not been allowed inside of the house, and he and Fred were standing together at the end of the driveway when an EMT came over and told them that, unfortunately, Carol was deceased. And no, it did not look like suicide, it looked like murder. By 10 p.m., crime scene techs and homicide detectives had also started arriving at the scene. Officers put up yellow crime tape to hold back the gathering crowd of friends and neighbors that had begun to gather in the street outside of the Newlander's house. Friends also drove to Rebecca's apartment in Philadelphia to bring her back to Cherry Hill to join her father and her brother Matt. Later that same night, Fred's assistant rabbi would call another rabbi near the University of Michigan, where Carol and Fred's other son Benjamin was a freshman, so Benjamin would not be alone when the call came through that his mother was dead. Meanwhile, the investigation into Carol's death was already moving quickly. By 11 p.m. that night, Camden County detectives John Long and Arthur Folks had already zeroed in on their first potential suspect, Fred. After all, he was both the husband of the victim and the person who found Carol's body. And detectives' initial impression of the crime scene had weighed against the idea that the murder had been committed by a stranger in the course of a robbery. There had been no forced entry, no sign that the house had been ransacked, and Carol was still wearing valuable gold and diamond jewelry when her body had been discovered. The detectives were also suspicious of how calm Fred was when they first saw him. And the fact that there was not a single drop or smear of blood on his clothing told them that after finding his wife laying there, Fred had not made any attempt to check for a pulse or try to offer his wife any kind of aid, because if he had, he would have had blood all over him. And although the detectives would have to wait until the forensics reports came back from the crime lab, the techs working the crime scene were not finding any fingerprints, no footprints or even impressions, and no sign of a murder weapon, which made investigators think that this attack had to have been carefully planned. and so detectives instantly became very interested in learning more about the Newlanders' marriage. But before even having their first informal interview with Fred, the detectives assigned police officers to start interviewing neighbors to see if anyone had information about when Carol arrived home that evening and whether neighbors had seen any recent unusual or suspicious activity. Detectives also wanted to know if there were any security cameras on nearby homes that might have captured footage of someone entering or leaving the Newlander house. With all that done, the two detectives left the house just after 11 p.m. and joined Fred and his two older children inside the heated interior of one of the ambulances still parked outside the house. And right away, after speaking with them, the detectives learned about a new number one suspect. Because Rebecca had wasted no time telling the detectives about the two visits her mother had had from the so-called bathroom man, the stranger who had gone into the Newlander home with Carol exactly 1 week ago with the empty envelope, and the second visit had been that night. And now it seemed clear that tonight's visit from the bathroom man must have happened just before Carol was killed. And when Fred told police that Carol often brought home large amounts of cash from the bakeries, detectives realized that if all that turned out to be true, Carol may have been the target of a robbery after all. This possibility was strengthened when Fred and his children were able to confirm that there was something missing from the Newlander house, the burgundy-colored wallet where Carol hid her envelope full of cash. By 1:30 a.m. in the early hours of Wednesday, November 2nd, so just hours after Carol has been found, detectives had relocated to the Cherry Hill police station and were ready to conduct individual formal interviews, starting with Fred and his children. Rebecca repeated her information about the bathroom man, as well as telling police every detail she could remember from her recent phone calls with her mother. As for her parents' marriage, she said she was not aware of any serious problems or issues, but then again, she said she had not been living with them for some time. But in the interview with Rebecca's brother, Matt, which began at 2:30 a.m., he reluctantly admitted that his parents might have been going through some issues in their marriage. He told them about how his parents had gotten into that big fight during their car ride home from New York 3 days earlier, and that after they had returned, his mother had told him that his dad wanted out of the marriage. But by Monday, Matt said that things seemed to have calmed down, and yesterday afternoon, so Tuesday, the day Carol was killed, she'd even called Matt and told him not to worry, that his parents had done a lot of talking together and everything was going to be fine. It was 3:30 a.m. when Fred finally was asked to come into the interrogation room. When he answered the detective's questions, his voice sounded tired. By the end of the interview, it was obvious that he was finding it difficult to focus. He told investigators that the day before, he and Matthew had left the house together after their dinner around 6 p.m., and that Fred had gone straight to the temple, where he stayed until just a few minutes after 9 p.m. And then he drove back home and he discovered his wife. When asked, Fred told detectives that he didn't think Carol was having any issues with any of her coworkers at Classic Cakes. He also told detectives that he couldn't think of really anyone in her life that would want to hurt her. And as for this bathroom man and the letter or package he wanted to give to Rabbi Fred, Fred just shook his head. Unexpected and sometimes bizarre visits came with the territory of ministering to the religious and spiritual needs of 920 different families. But Fred said he was not aware of or expecting any deliveries back on October 25th, so the bathroom man's first visit to Carol, or last night when the bathroom man had made his second appearance. He told detectives that Carol had mentioned the first encounter with the bathroom man to him, but she had seemed more amused by the whole thing than alarmed by it. And she had apparently not given anyone, including Fred or Rebecca or Matt, a real description of what the bathroom man had looked like, aside from saying he was big and dressed in a windbreaker. As for Fred's relationship with Carol, he said it was good, very good, that they both had been very faithful to each other and that they loved each other and never had to go get counseling or anything like that, and at no point had their relationship ever come close to being physically abusive. As Fred said all this, the detectives were acutely aware of the fact that Fred did not mention the fight he had apparently gotten into with Carol a few days earlier, according to his son Matt. When Fred was asked about the lack of blood on his clothes and why he hadn't at least reached down and checked for a pulse when he saw his wife on the floor, Fred bowed his head and then told them that it was immediately obvious to him that she was dead. A few hours after Fred's interview, on that same morning, Wednesday, November 2nd, police were back at the Newlander house to do a thorough inspection of the outside of the property. Crime techs had finished their work earlier in the morning and sent all the evidence they had collected from inside the house to the crime lab for analysis, and Carol's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Neighbors woke up that Wednesday morning to the sight of investigators using a ladder truck they'd borrowed from the local fire department to check the roof of the Newlanders' house for any clues. Police officers had also fanned out to interview Carol's business partners and staff at Classic Cakes and Fred's assistant rabbi from Temple McCour Shalom. Other officers were tracking down any leads or information about deliveries to the Newlander property that may have been scheduled for around the time Carol was killed. But despite the promising lead about the bathroom man and the momentum of the first 48 hours, the investigation into Carol's murder almost immediately slowed to a discouraging crawl. No one had come up with any information that would help police find this mysterious bathroom man. Investigators couldn't find any deliveries scheduled for the Newlander house on either October 25th or November 1st, the 2 days the bathroom man was there. And Fred's assistant rabbi just shook his head no when detectives asked him if he knew of any marital problems between Fred and Carol. On Thursday, 2 days after the murder, and the day Carol's body was released by the medical examiner's office back to her family, 2,000 people attended a funeral service for Carol that was held in the sanctuary of Temple McCour Shalom. And after the funeral service, Fred announced that Carol's Shiva, the Jewish equivalent of a wake, would be held at the Newlanders' house, in the same room where Carol was killed. Despite contractors having come in and thoroughly cleaned that room, Carol's friends and family still noticed faint bloodstains under the new coat of paint on the walls and ceiling. It wasn't until the Newlanders' phone records came back a few weeks after Carol's death that police finally got a break in the case. While looking for calls that had been made to or by Carol, police noticed one number that showed up over and over again. But it had nothing to do with Carol, and everything to do with her husband and a very high-profile member of his congregation. And by early December, police uncovered a scandal that would rock Cherry Hill and focus national media attention on one of the state's most charismatic religious leaders. Police would also find another possible suspect in the murder of Carol Newlander. It would turn out Fred had lied to police when he described his marriage as being really solid, and he'd told an even bigger lie when he described himself as being a faithful husband. Instead, starting on December 24th, 1992, so 2 years before Carol was killed, Fred had begun having an affair with a 48-year-old local celebrity and member of his congregation, Elaine Sonsini, and so that phone number that had shown up in the Newlanders' call records was Elaine Sonsini's number. Elaine was a well-known on-air radio personality who hosted a popular morning news program out of a big station in Philadelphia. She had met Fred when he had officiated her late husband's funeral. Before, and especially during, the rabbi's 6-month sabbatical, he and Elaine had been meeting up almost every day to have sex, even deadbolting the door of Fred's private office and using Temple McCour for their illicit get-togethers. As police started to press Elaine for details about her involvement with Fred and whether she had any direct or indirect involvement with the murder of his wife, Elaine, who had a solid alibi, decided it was time to lawyer up and go public with her side of the story and the details of the affair. And suddenly, Fred was back at the top of the suspect list, both in terms of the police investigation and the news accounts that were now appearing in major regional and local media. For Fred, when this affair went public, it was devastating. There are lots of married couples who have experienced infidelity, but in Fred's case, his affair and infatuation with Elaine had automatically stamped him not only as one of America's many unfaithful husbands, but also as a murderer. Even his alibi was now being treated by investigators and definitely by the media as too good, too convenient, that maybe the rabbi had just arranged for his wife's death so he could ride off into the sunset with the beautiful Elaine Sonsini. But despite Fred continuing to shout from the rooftops that he hadn't done anything and that the police still had not found a single shred of evidence connecting him to his wife's murder, Fred knew it didn't really matter, because the media, and to some degree the police, had already decided he was guilty. And so, desperate to clear his name, Fred went on the offensive. Not only did he hire a defense attorney to represent him, he also revealed to the public that within days of Carol's death, he had already hired his own private investigator to try to find out who killed his wife and why. 49-year-old Len Genoff had been both a member of Temple McCore and an acquaintance of Fred's since 1992. But it was Len's background in security and covert operations with the US and Israeli Secret Services, along with his private investigator's license, that had caught Fred's attention. Len also had close ties with the local police. And even though Len had not really made any more progress in finding Carol's killer than Camden County law enforcement, once Fred went public with Len's involvement in the case in early 1995, Len became a sort of unofficial spokesperson for the embattled rabbi. But for Fred, despite his best efforts, his life seemed to just continue to go from bad to worse. On February 26, 1995, the damage to his reputation had become so bad that he resigned his post as head rabbi of the synagogue he had founded 20 years earlier. Several months later, on June 9, 1995, Fred's lover, Elaine Sonsini, left Fred and married one of the police officers who had been assigned to help with the investigation into Carol Newlander's death. A year after that, in April of 1996, the Central Conference of American Rabbis suspended Fred from practicing as a rabbi for a minimum of 2 years as punishment for his extramarital affair. But despite Fred's life crumbling all around him, his private investigator continued to have his back, telling everyone that while Fred certainly was guilty of adultery, that didn't mean he was also guilty of murder. Fred deeply appreciated Len's support, but what he really needed from his private eye, or from anyone at this point, was evidence about who actually killed his wife. But it wasn't until late April 2000, almost 6.5 years after Carol Newlander was brutally murdered, that police finally would find that evidence. That month, investigators answered a phone call from someone who said they had important information that would help authorities identify Carol's killer. The conversation that came next would turn everything the police thought they knew about this case upside down. Based on what this caller was able to tell law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Carol on the evening of November 1st, 1994. The bathroom man was sure he had planned Carol's murder down to the last detail. But when Carol had let him into her house on the night of Tuesday, October 25th, he knew right away that he had made a mistake. As soon as he stepped inside, he had seen immediately that Carol's purse, and more importantly, the burgundy-colored wallet, were nowhere in sight. And so the bathroom man, he struggled for a moment, trying to keep his composure before changing his plan. He had to be sure the purse and the wallet were here. So, thinking quickly, he asked Carol if he could use her bathroom. But instead of actually going to the bathroom, the man just walked around Carol's first floor, checking all of the rooms for this purse and wallet. But when he couldn't find them, he knew he'd just have to come back another time. And so he walked back to the front door where Carol was, and he handed her that envelope, telling her it was the package he had come to give to the rabbi, and then he was about to leave when Carol had opened it up. Now, the bathroom man knew the envelope was empty. Delivering it to the rabbi was just his excuse he was using to get inside of the house. And so when Carol immediately opened the envelope right in front of him and told him, "Hey, look, it's empty," the bathroom man suddenly panicked, wondering if Carol was onto him. But he could see in her face right away that she wasn't. She was just concerned he had not delivered the right letter, and so he should come by another time when he had the right letter. 1 week later, on November 1st, the bathroom man took steps not to repeat his earlier mistake. This time, he waited until Carol had walked inside of her house, carrying her purse over her shoulder, before he also walked up to the door and began knocking. Bathroom man felt a stab of alarm when the door opened and he saw that Carol was talking to someone on the telephone. But that was followed by relief when she invited him inside before he even had to say who he was or why he was there. Once inside, he glanced quickly into both front rooms, and this time he saw the purse sitting on the dining room table. Even as Carol finished her call and placed the cordless phone down on the bench near them in the entryway, Bathroom Man was already adjusting his windbreaker to make sure he could easily access the 1-foot-long metal pipe he had stuck in his back pants pocket. Satisfied that the purse and wallet were definitely here, he focused again on Carol and heard her tell him to follow her through the living room into the sun parlor. But as soon as Carol had turned away from him and had begun taking a few steps across the hardwood floor onto the white carpet, Bathroom Man reached behind his back and pulled out the metal pipe and clutched it in his right hand. And then, with his left hand, he reached out and he grabbed Carol's left shoulder, forcing her to come to an abrupt stop, and then before she could turn around, Bathroom Man had lifted the pipe into the air and brought it crashing down into the back of Carol's head. A moment later, he used his left hand to shove Carol hard in the center of her back, sending her flying into the living room where her knees began to buckle out from under her. As she collapsed forward onto the ground, Carol uttered a single word: "Why?" Bathroom Man didn't answer her. Instead, he turned back to the door and quickly motioned to his much younger accomplice who was waiting outside in the bushes to come inside and finish the job. Seconds later, Bathroom Man had handed off the length of pipe to his much younger companion, and as Bathroom Man headed for the dining room to get the burgundy wallet out of Carol's purse, his companion got to work on Carol. From the dining room, Bathroom Man could hear the sickening thuds of what would be at least 12 savage blows to Carol's head that would break her skull and inflict catastrophic injuries to her brain. An autopsy would later show that Carol had tried to protect herself by putting her hands up over the back of her head, but this younger accomplice of Bathroom Man had hit her hands so hard with the pipe that he'd practically amputated one of her fingers. When Bathroom Man stepped back into the living room to make sure Carol was dead, he had to stop and catch his breath. The beating the younger companion had administered on Carol had taken less than a minute, but in those 45 seconds, the upswings of the metal pipe had sprayed the walls and ceiling with so much blood that it looked like a scene out of a horror movie. And Carol lay on her side at the center of it all, her neat blue pantsuit and print top slowly darkening in the pool of blood, spreading out around her and soaking into the thick pile of the white carpet. Bathroom Man walked over and checked Carol for a pulse, and when he didn't find one, he and his younger companion left the house. Once outside, the two men got into a single car and drove to a nearby brightly lit parking lot outside of a department store. After his younger accomplice changed into clean clothes, Bathroom Man gathered up any blood-stained belongings and the blood-stained pipe, and he stuffed it all into a small duffel bag. Then he pulled out Carol's burgundy wallet. He thought of the thousands of dollars that he was sure to find inside of it as a bonus payment on top of what he had already been paid to commit this murder. But inside the wallet, all he found was $150. The two killers split the money, and then with a sudden gesture of disgust, Bathroom Man threw the burgundy wallet onto the floor of his car. A minute later, Bathroom Man's accomplice had climbed out of the passenger seat and settled in behind the wheel of his own car that he'd parked there earlier in the evening. He gave Bathroom Man a wave before pulling out of the parking lot and heading back to the apartment the two men shared. A few minutes later, Bathroom Man was also on the road, but he was not going back to the apartment. Instead, he headed east towards the nearest police station. He stopped only once along the way to buy 4 cups of coffee. Later that night, he would make a drive out to Philadelphia and stop at different dumpsters along the way to dispose of the small duffel and bloody clothes, the murder weapon, and the empty burgundy wallet. But for right now, he had an alibi he needed to build. So at 9:12 p.m., Bathroom Man, aka Rabbi Fred Newlander's own private investigator, Len Genoff, did what he did on most Tuesday nights. He drove to the Evesham Township Police Station 5 miles from the Newlander house, and then he walked inside and made his way to the Detective Bureau, where he delivered the coffees he had bought to his good buddies on the night shift, and where he settled in to wait for the news to break that Rabbi Fred Newlander's wife was dead. It wouldn't be until 2 days after Carol's murder, on Thursday, November 3rd, at her funeral service in the sanctuary of Temple Makor Shalom, that Len would again see the person who had promised him $30,000 for killing the rabbi's wife. When it was Len's turn in line to console the stricken and grieving rabbi, Len stepped forward to shake Fred Newlander's hand, but before he could, Carol's husband pulled Len in for a big hug, and when the two men were cheek to cheek, Fred whispered his thanks in Len's ear for getting the job done. The murder had gone exactly as Rabbi Fred Newlander had planned it. It would turn out that back in the summer of 1994, not long after the end of Fred's 6-month sabbatical, his mistress, Elaine Sonsini, had told Fred he had until the end of that year to end his marriage with Carol, or Elaine would break off their affair. As the rabbi started to think about his choices, he decided he'd rather see Carol dead than risk the damage that a divorce might do to his reputation. So, in August, Fred approached Len Genoff, a member of his congregation who claimed to have worked with both the U.S. and Israeli secret services. Both those claims, and almost everything else Len had told people about his background, insecurity, and covert operations, turned out to be false. But when Len's rabbi and spiritual leader Fred Newlander asked him if he would be willing to put his skills to work and kill a so-called enemy of Israel, Len said yes. Only the enemy turned out to be the rabbi's wife, and her only sin was that she stood between the rabbi and his mistress. While Len knew who Carol was, Carol did not know who Len was. There were over 4,000 people in the congregation, and so Carol and Len had just never actually met. After Len agreed to do the job, Fred spent the next few months explaining to Len exactly how he wanted the murder to look, like a robbery gone wrong. Fred also gave Len a hand-drawn map showing the layout of the inside of the Newlander house and where Len should look for Carol's purse and wallet. The murder would have to take place on a Tuesday night when Carol and Fred's son Matthew was at work, and when there were enough evening activities at the temple that Fred could construct an airtight alibi for himself. Then, immediately after the murder, the rabbi would hire Len to act as a private investigator working to clear the rabbi's good name. Len had done a lot of things in his life that he was not proud of, but cold-blooded murder was not one of them. So, for this job, Len had decided to hire an accomplice, his 21-year-old roommate, Paul Daniels. Like his older friend, Paul was a recovering alcoholic, but he was also broke and he suffered from a variety of mental disorders. When Len offered Paul $7,500 if Paul would actually be the one to kill Carol, Paul could not believe his good fortune. On October 20th, 1994, 2 weeks prior to Carol's murder, when Len had actually handed the $7,500 to his young accomplice, Paul had grabbed the money and then jumped up out of his chair, where he spent most of his days watching TV, and he began yelling in excitement, "That bitch is dead!" But starting immediately after Carol's murder, the guilt over what he had done started eating away at Len Genoff. And by the beginning of 1996, so roughly a year and a half after Carol's murder, Len had become an off-the-record source, that's someone who was never identified by name, for a reporter who was covering the investigation into the Carol Newlander homicide. And by May of 2000, almost 6 years after Carol's death, that reporter, who had gradually learned the truth from Len, had convinced Len to go to police and tell them the truth about what happened to Carol. It would take 2 trials before a jury found Fred Newlander guilty of the murder of his wife Carol. As a star witness, Len Genoff was both a blessing and a curse. He could implicate the rabbi as the mastermind who set up the homicide, but Len's own history of telling one huge lie after another about his own life and background threw everything he had to say into question. And compared to the eloquent denials of Rabbi Fred, and the fact that there was no hard evidence linking the rabbi to the actual murder, Fred Newlander's first trial in 2001 ended in a hung jury. But by the time the case was retried less than 1 year later, Rabbi Fred had lost his most important supporters, his children, Matt and Rebecca, both of whom wound up testifying against him. In November of 2002, Rabbi Fred was found guilty of murder and conspiracy, and on January 15, 2003, he was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Both Len Genoff and his accomplice Paul Daniels were convicted of aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to a maximum of 23 years. They were both released from prison in 2014 after serving their mandatory minimum of 10 years. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please bring the 5-star review button to the movies with you, but instead of giving them popcorn, give them butter-covered styrofoam. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hey fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious, today's episode is a fan favorite. It comes from episode number 62, which is titled Murder Island. In late December of 2003, a 32-year-old man named Russell drove along scenic backroads on an island off the coast of Washington state until he arrived at his destination, a house tucked way back in the woods. After driving down the property's long driveway, Russell pulled into a parking spot and came to a stop. After turning off his car's engine, Russell went to unbuckle himself when he stopped, because right in front of him in the tree line, he saw a figure moving in the shadows. As Russell leaned forward and strained his eyes to see who it was, the figure suddenly emerged and began walking quickly toward Russell's car. At first, Russell thought he knew who this person was, but as they got closer, Russell realized he didn't. But before Russell could do anything about this situation, this stranger had arrived right outside of Russell's car door and had begun staring down at Russell through the glass. As they did this, Russell turned to look up at them, and what he saw was so shocking, he just froze in terror. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the 5-star review buttons bed, but when doing so, spread a thin layer of sand between their sheets. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. "32-year-old Russell Douglas climbed into the driver's seat of his bright yellow Chevy Tracker. Even though the forecast called for rain and clouds, there was nowhere Russell would rather have been than right where he was, on beautiful Whidbey Island, the place where Russell had spent most of his life. Just 35 miles long and 10 miles across at its widest point, Whidbey is the largest of 9 islands that make up the state of Washington's island county. All of the islands are clustered amid bays and inlets inside a body of water just off the western edge of Washington called the Puget Sound. The islands are all close enough to the mainland that you can look out over the sound and see the Olympic mountain range along the coast of Washington. But for islanders like Russell, Whidbey was a world away from the hustle and bustle and confusion of the mainland. And Whidbey's artsy little town of Langley, where Russell was spending this Christmas holiday, felt as much like a true home as the larger town further north, where he had actually grown up with his mom, stepdad, his brother, and sister. Before starting his car and heading west to the town of Freeland to run a few errands, Russell took a long look at the house he had once shared with Brenna, his wife of 9 years. Russell was not a person who had a lot of wonderful days, but on this particular morning, he was feeling better and happier than he had felt in a really long time. It was the day after Christmas, December 26th, 2003, and after a 7-month-long separation from Brenna and their 2 children, it now felt to Russell like he and his high school sweetheart might actually succeed in rebuilding their marriage and their relationship. Although Russell couldn't see any sign that Brenna was watching him leave or blowing him a kiss from a downstairs window, Russell still peered up at the house from the driver's seat and gave a wave and smiled before finally starting the engine and backing down the driveway. Even as he dropped his hand back down to the steering wheel, Russell knew that he was already expecting too much from Brenna. Russell had a habit of blaming circumstances, and in particular his mother and her strict upbringing, for many of the problems he experienced as an adult. But he was not blind to his own faults. Even before their separation, his marriage with Brenna had never been easy. which was one of the reasons why they waited almost a year after their first son Jack was born to get married. Russell knew that both he and Brenna were quick to get angry at each other, and Russell's habit of self-examination seemed like a waste of time to Brenna. To her, the questions that Russell jotted down to himself, like, "Why are you so afraid to just be without Brenna?" or "Why are you holding yourself and Brenna and the kids back?" were pointless. Russell just needed to make a decision one way or the other about their marriage and about what he wanted. Russell also knew he was subject to mood swings, and that he spent more time feeling depressed than he spent feeling upbeat. But no matter what he tried, therapy, the regular exercise that kept him trim and fit, writing those notes to himself, it still never took much for him to sink into a dark place. And Russell also knew that the chance he had now to try again with Brenna might be a very uphill struggle. Because during their separation, even though he had told himself that he'd use the time to think about their marriage, instead of actually doing that, almost immediately, Russell had struck up a new relationship with another woman, 50-year-old Marge Bailey. And even though their affair was over now, Russell knew it was still a huge sore spot for Brenna. But what Russell could never explain to Brenna was that that affair had actually helped him grow up and stop thinking of himself as a victim of his moods and of his overly strict and rigid upbringing. And when Russell had met Marge at a bar in the Washington resort town of Ocean Shores, shortly after he and Brenna had separated back in April of 2003, the last thing on his mind was a sexual relationship with Marge. But leaving Whidbey Island and his kids had been very difficult, and the small apartment he had rented in Renton, a suburb south of Seattle, was a typical and depressing bachelor pad, more like a storage container for his belongings than a home. And although his apartment was just 45 miles away from where Brenna lived with their kids, no sooner had Russell left the island that he felt the depression that he had always struggled with settle over him like a black cloud. So when Marge had walked up to Russell when he was sitting alone at the bar in Ocean Shores, he was grateful for her company. And right away, Russell and Marge had hit it off. It didn't take Russell long to discover that Marge was much more relaxed and open-minded than Brenna had been when it came to sex, and also when it came to Russell's own unconventional taste in clothes. If Russell wanted to wear a kilt or a sarong, a length of fabric that's tied around the waist like a skirt, that was fine with Marge. And if he wore pink spandex shorts and a gold necklace to his fitness club, that didn't bother her either. It was also fine with Marge that Russell was still married, and that he was not even sure if he wanted a divorce or not. And when Russell and Marge had finally ended their affair just a few weeks earlier, Marge had told him that if his marriage was really important to him, then he should try his best to fix it. So that's what Russell had decided he would do. According to the separation agreement that he and Brenna had worked out back in the spring, this was the Christmas that Russell was supposed to have 8-year-old Jack and 5-year-old Hannah. But when Russell had told Brenna that his affair with Marge was over, he'd also floated the idea to Brenna that he could just come to Whidbey Island over Christmas and all 4 of them, him and Brenna and their 2 kids, could spend the holiday together at their house in Langley. And Brenna had said yes. As Russell slowed down to make a left onto the main route that would lead him 13 miles west to Freeland, he looked down at his blue jeans and flannel shirt. Of course, along with agreeing to this Christmas reunion, Brenna had had a lot of other things to say as well, including the fact that she'd had enough of what she called Russell's deviant lifestyle. And by that, she didn't just mean his sense of adventure when it came to sex, but also his collection of slightly wild clothes. And even though Russell had been careful to dress in a style Brenna found acceptable during this reunion, he knew that since his arrival, he had already made at least one serious mistake. He'd been so excited about getting back together with Brenna that when he showed up for Christmas, he had given her some fancy lingerie, and inside the lingerie gift box, tucked under the folds of suggestive and flimsy fabric, he'd slipped an assortment of flavored condoms. Still, Brenna's annoyance with him had not stopped them from making love together earlier that very morning. And now, as Russell drove through some of the most beautiful landscapes in the Pacific Northwest, that voice inside him that constantly second-guessed his decisions and made him feel like happiness and contentment were always going to be out of his reach seemed to fade away. Not only was Russell back on his beloved Whidbey Island with Brenna and his kids, financially, his life was also improving. He'd recently gotten a small, but to him very meaningful, promotion at the land management company where he worked, and in just 4 months, he'd finish his online master's degree in business administration. He knew that the hairstyling business he and Brenna had bought together a year ago, so Brenna, a licensed beautician, could have her own salon, needed an infusion of cash to cover some debt Brenna had run up. But if they could make their marriage work, his skill with money management, coupled with her skills as a beautician, could put them on the path towards a comfortable financial future. He also knew that that kind of security and status was very important to Brenna. Even though she had never gone to college or spent really any time off of Whidbey Island, Brenna had a few close friends whose lives she envied. One of them was her best friend, Peggy Sue Thomas, who also happened to be a licensed hairstylist, as well as the owner of the house that Russell and Brenna rented in Langley. Although Russell had never been close friends with Peggy Sue, who was 4 years older than he and Brenna, it was impossible to grow up on Whidbey Island and not know about the 6-foot-tall high school basketball star from Langley with the outsized personality and fiery red hair. After high school, Peggy got married and then got her beautician license, just as Brenna would later do. But after Peggy's first marriage fell apart, she surprised everybody by joining the military and becoming one of the few female aircraft mechanics in the U.S. Navy. After that, Peggy went on to marry a fellow veteran, and when she left the service, she raised 2 daughters, and in addition to working on and off as a hairstylist alongside Brenna, Peggy Sue also got a job as a car mechanic. And when her second marriage ended in divorce as well in the 1990s, Peggy Sue responded to the fact that her husband had left her for another woman by hitting the gym. By the year 2000, Peggy Sue had lost 100 pounds, and that year, she won the Mrs. Washington beauty pageant. And now Peggy Sue was out in Las Vegas, Nevada, living the high life with her 2 daughters. It was hard not to feel a little jealous of Peggy Sue with her confident good looks and her grit, but at least if Russell and Brenna could get their marriage straightened out, they could actually buy Peggy Sue's house, since that had been the original plan back when Peggy Sue had moved to Las Vegas and agreed to rent the house to him and Brenna. As Russell made yet another decision, he would definitely talk to Brenna about buying that house. He also made a quick mental review of the directions he needed to follow to get to his next destination, an address on Wall Road just outside of Freeland. He was not familiar with this particular area he was going to. All he really knew was that Wall Road was about 4 miles outside of Freeland, and that lining the narrow roadway was a mixture of everything from churches to upscale homes and million-dollar getaway lodges for summer residents to rustic cabins and the occasional trailer. Looking out his car window at the hills that fell away to the ocean on his left, and catching a glimpse now and then between the trees of the white sailboats bobbing out on Puget Sound, Russell thought of the hikes he could take here with his children. Much as Russell had enjoyed his brief time with his lover Marge, he was now feeling like the separation had finally shown him how important his wife Brenna was in his life, the one constant that had given him more happiness and security than anything else. For Russell, that insight alone had felt like a huge win, and as he thought about it, he bumped the steering wheel with his fist in a gesture of celebration that he felt so ready to make this reconciliation with Brenna work for both of them. As Russell neared his destination, he slowed and began looking to the left and the right for the landmarks that would confirm he was in the right place. As he did this, he reminded himself that he just needed to be patient and give Brenna the time she needed to accept him back into her life. A little bit distracted by this thought, Russell turned into what turned out to be the wrong driveway. He knew he had made a mistake when he saw a red Volvo parked up ahead of him. He'd been told to look for an empty driveway. So he immediately stopped his car, he backed up, and resumed driving west on Wall Road, but very slowly now since he knew he must be getting close to his destination. And sure enough, several hundred yards further along, Russell saw that he'd arrived at the right place, 6665 Wall Road. He turned his Chevy Tracker onto the long driveway and drove to the end of it, where he pulled off to the right side into a parking spot that was at a right angle to the driveway. Beside him were 2 fir trees that cast a dark shadow over his vehicle. But before Russell could pull off the sunglasses he always used when driving so he could see better into the thickly forested and shady area in front of him, he noticed a figure emerge from the woods in front of him, and this person began walking directly toward him. Russell turned off his car engine, but before he could undo his seatbelt so he could get out of the car and greet this person, the person from the woods had rushed up right next to Russell's car door, blocking him from opening it. Russell turned to look at the stranger to see what they wanted, and when he realized what they were doing, he froze with fear. A few seconds later, and the world that Russell had finally begun piecing together in his mind for himself and his family ended in a sudden and terrific blow to his head. Almost 5 hours later, at about 4:30 p.m., two women who were residents of Freeland, who lived on Wall Road, were surprised to see a yellow Chevy Tracker parked in the driveway of one of their neighbors' houses. Not only was the car unfamiliar to them, but they could see in the near darkness that the driver's side door was open and the interior dome light of the car was still on. Also, the women knew that the owners of the house where the car was parked, the Black family, were not in town. They had gone to Costa Rica for a vacation. So the two women were very curious about who owned this yellow car and why they were there. However, none of the women wanted to approach this vehicle and anyone who might be inside of it when it was this dark outside and no one else was around. So the two women decided that if the car was still there tomorrow, they'd call the police. Then the two women just resumed their walk, made their way back to their own houses, and forgot about the bright yellow car with the open door. It wasn't until the afternoon of the next day, December 27th, that a dad out walking with his sons under a cloudy winter sky would also spot the yellow Chevy Tracker. Like the women who had been out walking the night before, Joseph Doucette, a schoolteacher who was staying with his family in a nearby cabin, was also immediately drawn to the car's open door. Joseph's first impulse was to walk over and shut the door before the interior light drained the car's battery, but when he called out and no one inside the car answered, he felt a sudden shiver of uneasiness, and instead of approaching the car right then, he turned around and took his kids back to the cabin. And then, at a slow run, he returned to the car alone, feeling a mixture of urgency but also fear. Telling himself to get a grip, Joseph took a deep breath and then walked down the long driveway. When he reached the open car door and looked inside, what he saw was so shocking and gruesome, he practically fell backwards as he tried to step away. There was a man inside the yellow car. Joseph registered that the man was young with sandy blonde hair and that once he must have been handsome, but now something red and sticky was hanging from his forehead and the man's clothes were covered in blood. His head and shoulders were slumped over the steering wheel, and his hands lay in his lap, the fingers balled into tight fists. Trying to keep from vomiting, Joseph turned around and began running while pulling out his cell phone and dialing 911. And 8 minutes later, at 4:34 p.m., as the sun fell below the horizon, the first police car arrived on the scene. Not long after that, the dark, quiet road was filled with other police and emergency vehicles and flashing blue and red lights. It didn't take long for the first medical responders to realize they were too late. The man inside of the car was obviously dead, and he was obviously dead from a bullet wound to the head. And once detectives arrived on the scene, it didn't take them long to realize that their first assumption about what had happened to the driver of this car was completely wrong. Given the fact that the residence where this man was found was not only totally isolated, but looked obviously vacant, it would turn out the Black family who owned the property really had been on vacation in Costa Rica at the time, and they would tell police they were not expecting anyone to be on their property while they were gone. And the fact that the driver was still buckled into his car seat, Detective Mike Plumberg's initial theory was that this must have been a suicide, that this man found this isolated place and this is where he took his life. Violent crimes on Whidbey Island were rare, but the suicide rate among islanders was actually pretty high, especially over the holidays. But even with the help of portable lighting that police used to illuminate the area around the car, officers could not find the one item that would even make suicide in this case a possibility, and that was the gun that had fired the fatal shot. But tucked away between the driver's seat and the door frame, Detective Plumberg did find the one item that would eventually prove critical to solving what he now realized was a homicide: the spent shell casing from a gun later identified as a .380 caliber Bersa pistol. Figuring out who the victim was did not take long. Whidbey Island was a small place where pretty much everyone knew each other. So when detectives examined the wallet inside the pocket of the dead man's pants, they recognized both his name and the Langley address printed on his driver's license. In the picture that stared back at them from the license, they recognized what was left of the driver's face. The murder victim was 32-year-old Russell Douglas. By 10 o'clock that night, the detectives were ready to clear the crime scene. Russell's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, crime scene techs had photographed and collected evidence, and police who had been sent out to interview nearby residents had already come back with 2 helpful pieces of information that would give them a window for when the crime had occurred. According to the owner of a house just down Wall Road, a yellow SUV had entered and then quickly exited her driveway where her red Volvo was parked between 11:30 and noon the previous day. And the 2 local women who were out for a walk the previous afternoon told police that they had seen the yellow car at the end of the Black's driveway at about 4:30 p.m. So the police knew the murder probably occurred between 11:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. What police did not uncover was any information about other unfamiliar cars or people entering or leaving the area during that time period. But before the police could move ahead with their investigation, Detective Plumfield and his partner needed to inform the victim's wife, Brenna Douglas, that her husband was dead. So, at about 10:15 p.m. on December 27th, the 2 officers were standing at the front door of the Douglases' modest house on Furman Ave in the town of Langley. Even though the lights in the house were out, the door was opened almost immediately. Brenna, a big, strong woman with curly brown hair, was standing in front of them, dressed in her nightclothes. Without asking why they were there, Brenna exchanged a short greeting and then invited the men inside. When one of the detectives asked if they could all sit down to talk, Brenna led them to the dining room table. As Detective Plumberg pulled out a pad of paper so he could take some notes, Brenna settled herself into her chair on the other side of the table and looked out at them with a blank expression. In any murder case, the spouse is always one of the first people of interest. So instead of disclosing that Russell was dead, the detectives began by asking Brenna when she had last seen her husband. Over the next hour, even after police told Brenna that they had just discovered Russell's body in his yellow car and that he had been shot once in the forehead right between his eyes, Brenna displayed no sign of grief or even surprise. Instead, she shocked detectives by giving a list of grievances and complaints about her recently murdered husband. According to Brenna, she had initiated their recent separation by kicking Russell out of the house 7 months ago. She'd also filed a report with police alleging that he was verbally and physically abusive, that he threatened to punch her in the face, and had once, years ago, hit their son across his face. And even though Brenna had withdrawn that complaint, she insisted to investigators that the information she had given police at the time was true. Russell had been controlling, he had once called her fat, and he had cheated on her both with women and with men. Brenna also claimed that Russell had downloaded tons of pornography to his computer and that he liked using sex toys. As for their recent reconciliation, it had been his idea more than her idea for the 2 of them to try to get back together and fix their marriage. And even though they had had sex during their Christmas reunion, Brenna told detectives that she had only done that because she wanted to feel loved. Brenna also told police that Russell abused both alcohol and drugs, and if he had any friends at all, they were only the friends that she herself had made and introduced him to. Brenna's barrage of criticism about the father of her children and the man who was never late with child or spousal support and who showed up right away when Brenna needed help with a household project not only shocked the 2 detectives, it made them wonder if all that bitterness Brenna was expressing to them added up to a possible motive for Brenna to kill her husband. Sensing that the police had found her response surprising, Brenna wasted no time sketching out her own airtight alibi for December 26th, the day Russell was killed, from the moment he had kissed her and the children goodbye before leaving mid-morning to run some errands, right through the early afternoon of December 27th. As to why she had not contacted anyone when Russell did not come back to the house that afternoon or night, Brenna said she assumed he'd probably just blown her off again. But even as police verified Brenna's alibi, she remained a person of interest, especially when investigators found out that Russell had made Brenna the beneficiary of 2 life insurance policies. One of them was worth $200,000, and the other was worth close to $400,000. Those suspicions sharpened over the next couple of weeks when the interviews they conducted with Russell's family, his former lover Marge, and his co-workers at the land management company where he worked all painted a very different picture of Russell and suggested that maybe Brenna either had a distorted view of her husband, or she wasn't telling the truth, or that Russell was one of those people who turned into a totally different person when he was with his wife and kids. Because according to those other witnesses, Russell was a friendly, almost shy loner who had surprised his boss one day by wearing a kilt to work. But Russell came across in interviews as a smart and hardworking employee who took to heart his boss's request that Russell stick with more conventional wardrobe choices at work. Russell was definitely prone to depression, but his coworkers had never seen any sign that he was a drinker or that he even dabbled in drugs. Russell was excited about earning his master's in business administration. He obviously loved his kids. He talked a lot about the marital problems he and Brenna were having without ever bashing Brenna, but he also seemed very hopeful that they could save their marriage. And those close to both Russell and Brenna said the arguments between husband and wife were definitely two-sided, that Brenna had a short fuse and that her poor money management had led to her hair salon sinking into debt. If that was true, that Brenna was in serious debt, then Brenna would have a financial motive for getting rid of Russell and claiming the payout from his life insurance policies. Brenna had told detectives that she was not aware of Russell having any life insurance policies, but right after saying this to police, Brenna had contacted Russell's insurance companies and put in her claim as Russell's beneficiary. However, since Brenna was suspected in Russell's death, the insurance company would not allow her to collect any money. Instead, the insurance company sent investigators of their own out to speak with police about Brenna's possible involvement in Russell's death. And what Detective Plumberg found out in speaking with the insurance company's investigators was that Brenna had presented herself and Russell very differently to the insurance company than she had to police. To insurance investigators, she described Russell as a loving and supportive husband, and as a couple, they were committed to reconciliation after going through a minor rough patch in their marriage. At around the same time police were speaking with the insurance investigators, an examination of Russell's work computer and personal laptop were completed, and what police learned was that 1, Brenna had full access to her husband's email and bank accounts, and 2, Russell was not a big consumer of pornography like Brenna had said. After her initial interview with detectives on the night Russell's body was discovered, Brenna quickly hired a lawyer, she refused to take a lie detector test, and then she refused to answer any more questions unless the police could come up with hard evidence that would link Brenna to her husband's murder. And as suspicious as this made Brenna seem, the police didn't have any hard evidence connecting her to her husband's murder, and so for the time being, they had to leave her alone. However, that would change a few weeks later when police were able to examine Russell's phone records. And there was one number with an out-of-state area code that popped up a couple of times in the second half of December that did not fit the pattern of other calls to or from Russell's cell phone. And when Detective Plumberg called that number out in Las Vegas, Nevada, they found one of the things they'd been hoping for. Anyone who had a link to both the victim, Russell, and to their person of interest, his wife, Brenna. That person turned out to be none other than Peggy Sue Thomas, Brenna's best friend, who had moved off Whidbey Island back in 2000. That's when Peggy had gone to Las Vegas to compete in the Continental Mrs. USA pageant. Although Peggy Sue had won the evening gown competition and impressed judges with her stint in the Navy as an aircraft mechanic, she had not won the title. But during that competition, Peggy Sue had fallen in love with the bright lights and big city feels of Las Vegas. That's when she rented her house to Russell and Brenna and moved with her 2 daughters to Henderson, Nevada, just outside of Las Vegas, where Peggy now made a good living as a glamorous limousine driver with a loyal clientele of high rollers and big tippers. Peggy told detectives that she and her boyfriend had been out to Whidbey Island over the Christmas holiday, and that she, Peggy, had seen Russell at his apartment just outside of Seattle on December 23rd. But she had only seen him long enough to hand him a Christmas gift that was for his wife, Brenna. That's what the 3 phone calls that the police had seen in the phone records were about. Peggy had called Russell to arrange this gift exchange, but when he didn't answer that call, the 2 of them had kind of played phone tag for a little bit before they did connect and make their plans. As for Peggy Sue's boyfriend, Jim Huden, he was also a native of Whidbey Island, But he'd left the island years ago after he had struck it rich selling a computer program he had designed to the computer giant Microsoft. And although Peggy Sue and Jim had spent Christmas together in Washington state, Jim had not come with her to see Russell on the night of the 23rd to deliver the package for Brenna. Peggy Sue admitted that most of what she knew about Russell was secondhand information she had gotten from his wife and her best friend, Brenna, and almost all of it was very negative about how terrible Russell was. However, Peggy Sue would tell police that during her brief visit with Russell on the 23rd, he was very nice and seemed happy and excited about spending Christmas with Brenna and the kids. By the time the call ended with Peggy Sue, Detective Plumberg had started to wonder if Russell's murder would ever be solved, because every lead they followed up on seemed to turn into a dead end. By June 2004, 5 months after Russell's murder, and with no fresh or promising leads, Detective Plumberg decided to go back and review the entire investigation. But it wouldn't be until the end of July, a full 7 months after Russell had been shot at point-blank range, that police would get the first of a string of tips that would eventually break the murder case wide open. And the first of those tips would come so far out of left field that at first, Detective Plumberg literally could not believe what he was hearing. On July 26th, the Island County Sheriff's Office picked up a call from a man who asked them if they had any information on an unsolved homicide that had happened around Christmas the year before, in 2003. When the detective who had answered the call replied that they did have such a case, the caller went quiet. After a few long seconds, the man told the investigator that he had information, but he was, quote, scared to talk about it. Over the next several days, this caller, who initially refused to give police his name or his location, would eventually give Island County detectives his own name, Bill Hill, and the name of a person who Bill said had first-hand knowledge of who killed Russell Douglas. After chasing down so many false leads and dead ends in this murder investigation, Detective Plumberg was very skeptical of the story. But as more and more details showed that Bill wasn't just getting his information from news stories, the detective got more and more interested. And by August 4th, 2004, just a week after Bill had made his first call to the Island County Sheriff's Office, Detective Plumberg and his commander were on a plane headed to Florida to talk with Bill's mysterious person of interest. At the same time, 2 other detectives were on a plane headed to Las Vegas to have another chat with Brenna's best friend, Peggy Sue Thomas. Once Detective Plumberg and his commander arrived in the small town of Punta Gorda on the southwest coast of Florida, they wasted no time following up on the tip they had received from Bill. Not only were they very eager to talk to this mystery witness, they were also eager to get back out of Florida before the big storm system that was forming out over the Caribbean Ocean just off the coast of Central America turned into a hurricane. But just a few hours after knocking on the door of this new person of interest, Detective Plumberg was once again feeling defeated and more confused than ever. Their mystery witness had been more than willing to talk with the detectives and had even gone with them to the local Punta Gorda police station for questioning. But they denied knowing anything about what happened to Russell and were flabbergasted when they were asked if they were involved in the murder. Their response to that question was, "Why would I do that? What possible motive could I have?" And in truth, Detective Plumberg was secretly thinking the same thing. It didn't make any sense. Plus, he knew that police had no hard evidence at all that could link anyone, including this new mystery person in Florida, to Russell's murder. An hour later, the interview was over, and Detective Plumberg's mystery witness had left the police station and returned home. The only good news for the Washington Island County detectives was that they'd still managed to fly out of Florida ahead of the storm. And they were lucky because by August 9th, just a few days after they had left, that storm had turned into a Category 4 hurricane that headed straight into Florida's southwestern coast and the town of Punta Gorda, where they had been. Meanwhile, the team of Island County detectives who had headed to Las Vegas had hit a similar dead end. In his conversation with Island County investigators, the caller, Bill Hill, had mentioned the name of a woman named Peggy, as well as the name of another woman, Brenna. Bill had told police that he'd heard both names mentioned in connection with Russell's murder. With Brenna no longer talking to investigators, Detective Plumberg had wanted his officers to speak again to Peggy Sue, and this time in person and on the record. But Peggy Sue said she had no information for County Island officers. She was also outraged at the sight of detectives showing up with a search warrant at her house in Henderson, Nevada. Peggy Sue watched as police searched everywhere in her house for any evidence that she had lied to police when she described her meeting with Russell on December 23rd at his apartment. And after the police could find no evidence, the very frustrated investigators began asking Peggy Sue about her boyfriend, Jim Huden, and his possible connection to Brenna or Russell Douglas. But it would turn out that not only had Jim never met Russell, Jim had left Peggy Sue in early February of 2003, 2 months after Russell's murder, and the couple had not parted on friendly terms. Jim had been married when Peggy Sue had met him on Whidbey Island in 2002, and even though he'd lived with Peggy in Las Vegas for several months, ultimately he decided to return to his wife and his small computer software business. That said, Peggy Sue could still account for their movements on the day Russell was killed, December 26, 2003. And she even managed to locate some old receipts from that day to show detectives exactly where they had gone on Whidbey Island before leaving Washington State late that night to return to Nevada. When detectives pressed Peggy Sue on having a financial motive for killing Russell, maybe she was going to split his life insurance policy with her good friend Brenna, Peggy pointed out that she already made a very comfortable living, so why would she do that? So, a few days later, Island County detectives came back from Nevada as empty-handed as Detective Plumberg had been when he came back from Florida. But 15 days later, on August 18, 2004, all of that would change. That was the day that the local Whidbey newspaper ran a news story based on unofficial sources that mentioned that former Whidbey Island residents Jim Huden and Peggy Sue Thomas were persons of interest in the ongoing investigation into Russell Douglas's murder. And on August 19th, 1 day later, yet another person who said they knew something about the case stepped forward. This time, it was a former police officer named Keith Ogden who lived in New Mexico. Keith, who had heard about the news story from a cousin who lived on Whidbey Island, would tell Island County investigators a story that put everything they had heard on their recent trips to Florida and Nevada in a whole new light. Because not only did Keith have the name of the likely murderer, he also had the weapon that was likely used to kill Russell Douglas. It was the .380 Bersa pistol, and ballistic tests would soon confirm that the markings on the shell casing found at the crime scene and the bullet that had been removed from the inside of Russell's skull exactly matched the grooves on the inside of that gun. The murder weapon, combined with the stories police now had from both Keith and their other informant, Bill Hill, finally allowed Detective Plumberg and his team of investigators to identify Russell's killer. Based on that information, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Russell Douglas on December 26, 2003. On that morning, Russell took special pleasure in the time he was spending with his family. Their Christmas celebration the day before had been everything he could have wished for. After arriving in Langley on Christmas Eve, Brenna had taken his car to the store and bought pies and other fixings for the Christmas dinner they planned to share the next day with Brenna's widowed stepfather. And except for Russell's gift of lingerie to Brenna, the other gifts he had brought for his family, especially the new Xbox video game console he'd bought for Jack, turned out to be nothing short of inspired. After Brenna's stepfather left at 5 or 6 p.m., Russell and Jack played Xbox while Brenna and Hannah watched a movie together. Once the kids were in bed, Russell was allowed into Brenna's room where they watched a movie together in bed and then fell asleep. And then on that morning, the 26th, he and Brenna made love. Now, having eaten breakfast with the kids, Russell was getting ready to go out and run a few errands. In fact, he had arranged a surprise for Brenna, one that he knew would make her happy. So, at about 10:45 or 11 a.m., Russell gave Jack, Hannah, and Brenna each a kiss and a hug before leaving the house and climbing into the driver's seat of his yellow Chevy Tracker. Whether anyone inside the house saw him or not, it felt good to wave at the house where his family lived before he pulled out onto Furman Ave and headed west toward Freeland. Russell's killer had chosen the time of their rendezvous very carefully. They had given Russell clear directions, and they also knew that Russell was very punctual, and if anything, he might arrive a little early. But the killer was in place and ready well before Russell arrived. The killer had only test-fired the Bersa pistol a few times, but at close range, they figured it would be nearly impossible to miss. Right on time, the killer heard the sound of an approaching car, and so before Russell pulled into the driveway, the killer stepped back into the shadows and waited. A moment later, Russell pulled his yellow Chevy Tracker into the long driveway that led to 6665 Wall Road. Now that he saw how out of the way this place was, he wondered why on earth they hadn't agreed to meet somewhere closer to Langley. Still, Russell had enjoyed the drive, and except for his wrong turn into that driveway up the road, he hadn't really had any trouble finding their meeting spot. Anyway, it would make a good story to tell Brenna, since she was the reason he was here in the first place. Almost as soon as Russell had pulled into that parking spot and turned off the car engine, he saw a figure in front of him step out of the woodline. With the sunglasses still on, it was hard to make out this person's face, but Russell figured it had to be the woman he was here to meet. How many other women were 6 feet tall on Whidbey Island? But before Russell could unbuckle his seatbelt and step out of the car to greet Peggy Sue, this person from the tree line had rushed over to his vehicle and stopped right outside of his car door, kind of blocking him from getting out. And so as they did that, Russell turned and looked at them and realized very quickly this person was not Peggy Sue. He didn't know who this person was. Instinctively, Russell just started to roll down his window to ask this person what they wanted. But as he was rolling the window down, Russell suddenly froze because this stranger was now holding a pistol. And without ever saying a word, the stranger raised the pistol, aimed it at Russell's face, and pulled the trigger. As the bullet traveled through Russell's brain, his brain tissue stretched along the trajectory of the bullet, and when the tissue did tear, it snapped back into place with force so great that Russell's forehead suddenly bulged outward, and along with blood, the gray matter of Russell's brain began leaking in ropey strands out of the small hole centered right between his eyes. Before leaving, the killer opened the driver's side door of the Tracker. They wanted to make sure Russell really was dead. By the time the police discovered Russell's body one day later, his body was stiff and cold to the touch. Even before the EMTs confirmed the cause of death, Detective Plumberg would describe the wound as a massive head trauma caused by an execution-style shooting that occurred from a distance of just 12 inches. It would turn out Russell's killer was Peggy Sue's boyfriend, Jim Huden. And it was Peggy Sue who had arranged the time and place where Russell would be murdered. Peggy Sue had in fact called Russell several times not long before Christmas to arrange a meeting so Peggy Sue could give Russell a Christmas present from her to Brenna. But Peggy Sue never then went to Russell's apartment in Renton on December 23rd to drop that present off. Instead, Peggy had told Russell on the subsequent phone calls to meet her on December 26th at 6665 Wall Road, and at this meeting she would give him her present for Brenna. Peggy had chosen this location because it was already a very isolated spot, and the family who lived at 6665 Wall Road, the Black family, they'd be gone in Costa Rica, so there'd be no witnesses. And so on December 26th, when Russell arrived at the meeting spot, instead of Peggy Sue coming up to him, it was her boyfriend, Jim Huden, who would step out of the tree line, walk over to Russell's car, and then shoot Russell point blank in the face. It would turn out that during the 4 months that Jim and Peggy Sue had lived together in Las Vegas back in 2003, Peggy had spent a lot of time on the phone listening to Russell's wife, Brenna, complain about Russell. None of what Brenna had to say was new, but now Peggy Sue could share her friend's complaints with her new boyfriend, Jim. When Jim later confessed his crime to his good friend, Bill Hill, down in Florida, where Jim lived with his wife, Jean, Jim told his friend that he decided to kill Russell because Peggy had told him Russell was abusive to his wife and children. Jim said that he himself had had a violent stepfather, and killing Russell seemed both thrilling and like a kind of revenge killing for what Jim himself claimed to have suffered. Island County detectives in Washington had a different theory. They believed that Brenna may have offered to split the proceeds from Russell's life insurance if Peggy and Jim killed Russell. At that point in Peggy Sue's life, and Jim's life too, money had become a big problem. 7 months after hearing Jim's confession, Bill Hill's conscience finally got to him, and he contacted investigators in Whidbey and told them what he knew. But even though detectives then flew to Florida to question Jim, who was the so-called mystery witness, and Nevada to question Peggy Sue, it wasn't until Keith Ogden contacted police on August 18th and provided the murder weapon that police would have the physical evidence they needed to arrest Jim for murder. According to Keith, who had met Jim and Peggy in Nevada, Jim had approached Keith and asked him to hold on to a gun for him since Jim said he didn't want to keep it in a house with Peggy's kids. Keith agreed, but when Keith heard that Jim was a suspect in a homicide, he realized the gun Jim had given him could potentially be a murder weapon, and so that's why he had come forward. 4 months later, in December of 2004, almost a year to the day that Russell was killed, Detective Plumberg requested an arrest warrant be issued for Jim Huden. But it would take another 7 years before either Jim or Peggy Sue were actually arrested and charged for the murder of Russell Douglas. Shortly after being interviewed by investigators down in Florida in August of 2004, Jim, the mystery witness, had taken advantage of the chaos caused by Hurricane Charlie to flee over the border from the U.S. into Mexico. It wasn't until Jim's wife, Jean, who got tired of sending money to her husband in Mexico, came forward that the police were finally able to track Jim down. And so on June 9th, 2011, Jim was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. While Jim had been on the run, Peggy Sue had gone on to marry and then divorce Alaskan oil millionaire Mark Allen. After 7 months of marriage to him, she had walked away with more than $1 million in money and assets. At the time of her arrest, 1 month after Jim's, on July 9th, 2011, Peggy Sue was living off the shore of New Mexico on a houseboat she had named Off the Hook. While Jim refused to implicate Peggy Sue in Russell's murder, Peggy Sue didn't waste a minute before she put the full blame for Russell's murder squarely on Jim's shoulders. 1 year after their arrests, on July 20th, 2012, 59-year-old Jim Huden was convicted of first-degree murder in the shooting death of Russell Douglas and sentenced to 80 years in prison at the Washington State Penitentiary. 6 months later, on January 26, 2013, 3 days before her murder trial was scheduled to begin, 47-year-old Peggy Sue Thomas Allen pled guilty to a lesser charge of first-degree criminal assistance involving first-degree murder. Peggy Sue was given the maximum sentence of 4 years in prison at Washington Corrections Center for Women. The presiding judge said he regretted the Washington state statute that limited him to imposing what he called a shockingly short sentence. Peggy Sue was released in 2016. Russell's wife, Brenna, who now goes by her maiden name, Brenna Haslam, has never faced any formal charges in her husband's murder, although Island County investigators have continued to treat her as a person of interest. In December of 2005, so 2 years after Russell's death, his insurance company agreed to release a payout of $400,000 from his life insurance policy to Brenna. Brenna used the money to buy a new car and a new house that she subsequently lost 1 year later when she stopped paying the mortgage. There is no hard evidence that Russell Douglas ever physically abused his wife or his children. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the 5-star review buttons bed, but when doing so, spread a thin layer of sand between their sheets. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hey fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Today's episode is a fan favorite. It comes from episode number 32, which is titled The Sniper, the Blonde, and the Beefcake. One September night in 2006, a man left his office and walked across the vacant parking lot towards his truck. When he climbed inside the driver's seat, he instantly noticed that the back left of his vehicle seemed to be sagging slightly. But before he could figure out why it was doing that, he thought he saw something moving in his peripheral vision off to his left. So he turned and looked out his window into the dark night, and there, only a few feet away from him, was a shadowy figure who began to raise their hands. While most of you will figure out what is going on early in the story, I would encourage you to stick around to the very end, because at the end, there is a very disturbing plot twist that is the primary reason people even know about this case. This story contains sexual content as well as graphic violence, and so listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, just as the 5-star review button is about to blow out the candles on their birthday cake, lean in and blow them out yourself. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. "46-year-old Thomas Montgomery was a company man. For the last 12 years, he had punched a time clock at Dynabrade Incorporated, a factory in upstate New York that made high-quality power tools, from industrial-grade sanders to wheel grinders. So, when Thomas woke up on a Monday morning early in May of 2005, his routine that day was pretty much the same as it had been for the more than 500 Mondays that had come before it. Hearing the alarm go off at around 5:30 a.m., Thomas automatically reached out an arm and shut it off before the sound could wake up Cindy, his wife of 16 years, who was sleeping in the bed next to him. Then Thomas got up, grabbed his work clothes, and headed for the bathroom. 15 minutes later, he was walking down the upstairs hallway of his family's modest 2-story house, past the bedrooms of his 2 daughters, one 12 years old and the other 14. After getting downstairs, he walked into the kitchen where he grabbed a cup of coffee and a quick bite to eat. As he sat at the kitchen table having his breakfast, he saw the family dog, Shadow, waiting at the back door, her tail slapping side to side. After he was done with his food and drink, Thomas pulled on a light jacket and a ball cap before opening the door and following Shadow outside into the chilly morning air. 15 minutes later, the dog was fed and back on her dog bed, the coffee cup and dirty breakfast plate were in the sink, and Thomas was climbing into his car and getting ready to back out of the driveway. But first, Thomas had to reach over his belly to pull on his seatbelt. And as he did this, he was reminded that he was a good 25 years and 50 pounds away from his physical prime, back when he was a U.S. Marine. Thomas had never seen combat while he was in the military, but his 6 years in the Marine Corps still gave Thomas a deep sense of pride, especially considering the fact that at the time, the United States Marine Corps was undertaking some of the most dangerous missions in the U.S. war against terror in Iraq. Pulling his mind back to the present, Thomas finally buckled his seatbelt, then started the car engine and backed out of the driveway onto the quiet residential street on the outskirts of Buffalo, the second largest city in New York State. After tuning the car radio to his favorite sports station, Thomas then headed north to pick up New York State Highway 5, which would take him to Clarence, New York, where Dynabrade was located. Settling back into the driver's seat, Thomas made the uneventful 12-mile drive from Cheektowaga, the town where he lived, to his company's factory and their surrounding sea of parking lots. Thomas found a parking spot shortly before 7 a.m., and then he hopped out of his car and walked inside the building to join the line of other Dynabrade machinists, all getting ready to clock in, put on their clear plastic safety glasses, and get to work. 8 long hours later, Thomas had clocked out and was back in his car headed home. In about half an hour, he'd be walking the dog again, and when that was done, he'd be taking his 2 daughters off to swim practice at the local swim club, where he spent so much time that the club had asked him to be its vice president. But as Thomas made the 20-minute drive back home, his thoughts had skipped ahead from swim practice and then dinner to how he planned to spend that evening. For years, Thomas had lived for his Friday nights. That was when he and some buddies from work got together to play poker. However, recently, Thomas had discovered a new hobby, one that was more exciting than poker, and one that he could enjoy every night of the week. Thomas had discovered an internet website called Pogo.com. Launched in 1998, Pogo was a platform that offered everything from Scrabble and Monopoly to card games like Blackjack. If you signed up for a membership, like Thomas had, you could skip most of the ads. Players used tokens rather than real money, but you could exchange those tokens for rewards and prizes of real monetary value. Players created usernames and online profiles, and not only could they play games against each other and with each other, but they could also use the chat room feature on Pogo that allowed them to message other players in their game, as well as other Pogo users that were outside of their particular game. While some of the chat rooms were technically listed as being just for kids, and there were other digital rooms that were just for adults, in reality, Pogo generally relied on its members and players to self-enforce the age restrictions. Thomas was aware that the site was used primarily by young people. He and his wife Cindy were both active in their local church, and as a Sunday school teacher himself, Thomas overheard his students talking about Pogo all the time. Thomas also knew that one of his younger co-workers at Dynabraid, a 22-year-old named Brian Barrett, was also a big Pogo user. In fact, it was Brian's offhanded mention of the site that had led Thomas to check it out in the first place. But after Thomas signed up for the site, and he saw how much fun it was to get to play cards every night, he quickly stopped caring about the fact that he was likely one of the oldest people on there. In fact, he didn't even think about it. He hopped into different games and chat rooms without so much as looking at the age restrictions on them. So, back on that Monday night in May of 2005, after Thomas had walked his dog and taken his kids to swim practice and had dinner, after all that, he shooed his two daughters off of the family computer in the living room, and with his wife Cindy sitting nearby in her usual spot on the sofa watching TV, Thomas made himself comfortable and logged into Pogo. Just typing in his screen name, which was Marine Sniper, gave him a sense of satisfaction. Thomas had never actually been a sniper in the Marine Corps, but the name reminded him of his glory days in the service. Usually, on Pogo, Thomas would just go straight to the Texas Hold'em poker rooms, but tonight he decided to play a little blackjack. But Thomas had hardly started looking at his first hand when he heard a ping and saw he'd gotten a direct message from another player with the screen name Tall Hot Blonde. Her private message just said to him, "You're in the wrong room. This room is for kids." Thomas had a moment of panic. He hadn't checked to see whether this chat room/game room was for kids or adults, and suddenly he wondered what would happen to him if it was revealed that he was a 40-something-year-old man playing with kids. Would he be kicked off of Pogo? Thomas did not want that to happen. Thomas loved Pogo. Playing these online card games and chatting with random strangers in the chat rooms had become an escape from the daily drudgery of his job and his routine. It also took his mind off the fact that in the last year or so, he'd had more and more problems with impotence, and that had put a strain on his marriage. His wife, Cindy, wanted to talk to him about it and spend more time together. Thomas, on the other hand, wanted to just ignore it and be left alone. So it didn't take Thomas long to decide how he was going to respond to Tall Hot Blonde's message. A second later, Thomas, aka Marine Sniper, wrote back, "Don't worry, I'm 18 years old. What about you? How old are you?" While Tall Hot Blonde didn't tell Marine Sniper her real name, she did tell him that she was a 17-year-old high school senior who lived in Western Virginia. She liked sports, and she played on her school's softball and basketball teams, and she wasn't sure yet what she was going to do after high school. "And what about him?" she typed. "Are you really a sniper?" Sitting there in front of the computer screen, Thomas felt a sudden, intense rush of excitement. The question had given him a very unexpected thrill. He would never meet this girl, and here he had an opportunity to play the part of his much more interesting and exciting and exaggerated younger self. So, Marine Sniper told Tall Hot Blonde that, yes, well, soon he would be a sniper. He was a Marine recruit for now who went by the nickname Tommy. He was about to start boot camp soon, then he would go to sniper school, and then after that he would deploy to combat in Iraq. By the time Thomas had shut down his computer 2 hours later, Tall Hot Blonde had sent him pictures of herself wearing a small yellow bikini that showed off both her curves and her flat belly. She'd eventually told him that her real name was Jessica, but she went by Jessie, spelled Jessi. She had one brother, and her family lived in a small house in the backwoods of West Virginia where nothing exciting happened, at least not since she had come in first place in a local beauty contest back in 2002. As Thomas turned out the downstairs lights and went upstairs to join Cindy in bed, he kept seeing those pictures of Jessie. With her wide smile, shoulder-length straight blonde hair, and long tanned legs, she more than lived up to the promise of her screen name. Thomas was already secretly hoping that the next time he logged on to Pogo, Tall Hot Blonde would be waiting for him. Thomas was still thinking about those pictures of Jessie when he woke up the next morning, and as soon as dinner that night was over, Thomas headed straight for the family computer. A minute later, he was on Pogo. Despite telling himself that this time he was just going to play a couple of hands of Texas Hold'em and then log off, Thomas kept clicking on his Pogo chat feature inbox, hoping he would see a private message come through from Tall Hot Blonde. And he didn't have to wait long. As soon as he saw the words, "Tommy, is that you?" pop up on his screen, Thomas felt that same thrill course through him that he'd felt the night before. And this time, there was no hesitation at all. Thomas began to add one lie after another to the fantastical story he told Tall Hot Blonde about Marine Sniper Tommy. After that, every night over the next few weeks, Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde told each other intimate details about their lives. While the real Thomas Montgomery still got up early every morning to go to Dynabraid and spend 8 hours making components for power tools, in the evenings, he became the man he had dreamed of being. While Thomas was overweight and balding, Marine Sniper was 6 foot 2 inches tall and 190 pounds of pure muscle. While Thomas came home after work and walked the family dog and took his daughters to swim practice, Marine Sniper had the broad shoulders that Jessie had said she liked, along with a black belt in karate. While Thomas wore glasses and covered his bald spot with a ball cap, Marine Sniper looked a lot like a younger red-haired version of Hollywood heartthrob Harrison Ford. Soon, Jessie and Tommy had moved off of the Pogo chat feature and had started emailing each other and using Yahoo's instant messaging feature. Jessie's instant messenger name was Peaches0617, while Thomas went by Tommy Loves WV Fox. WV Fox stood for West Virginia Fox, clearly an allusion to Jessie. When Jessie finally asked Tommy to send her a picture, Thomas sent the headshot of himself that was taken almost 30 years earlier when he had graduated from boot camp. Even though it seemed fairly obvious that his picture was very out of date, Jessie didn't care. She was totally infatuated. And her fascination only grew as Thomas started concocting a tragic and hard luck backstory for Tommy that would make Jessie feel protective and sympathetic. According to Thomas, Tommy's father had also been a Marine, Tommy's mother had died of cancer, and that had been such a terrible blow that Tommy's life had gone completely off the rails. In fact, his decision to join the Marines and become a sniper was so he could finally just make a fresh start with his life after a high school cheerleader had threatened to ruin his life by accusing him of rape. When Thomas told Jessie that before meeting her online, his plan had been to commit suicide in Iraq, Jessie had begged Tommy to stay alive for her sake. Jessie worried endlessly about Tommy's safety, and she told him again and again that despite whatever mistakes he had made in the past, she was proud of him and would always stand by him. After reading that, Tommy told Jessie that the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, which means always faithful, should be their motto too. Over the next 6 months, both Thomas and Jessie would become completely obsessed with their relationship, to the point where it was the only thing either of them ever thought about. Unlike 46-year-old Thomas, who struggled with impotence, 18-year-old Marine Sniper told Jessie that he had 9 inches worth of endowment. Meanwhile, Jessie sent Tommy dozens of pictures of herself. However, none of them were her in the nude. She was always wearing clothes or a bathing suit. But to Thomas, the hours he spent wondering what was under those bathing suits made her photos even more enticing. There was one picture in particular, the camera peeking up under her miniskirt from behind, that really stirred Thomas's imagination. Within weeks of meeting each other, Thomas and Jessie were having virtual sex every night, and Jessie was telling Tommy that she loved him. Whenever Thomas's wife, Cindy, walked over to him and asked what he was doing on the computer, Thomas would immediately click out of the chat and insist that he was just playing online card games. And because Cindy was always asleep by the time Thomas eventually came to bed, she wasn't aware of the fact that Thomas was routinely staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, telling Jesse all about what his, quote, snake would like to do to his, quote, foxy lady down there in West Virginia. And when Cindy did try to talk with Thomas about spending more time together, one of the remedies that their minister had suggested when they sought help for Thomas's impotence, Thomas told her that it was her nagging and her criticism of him that had led to his impotence problem in the first place, and so he didn't want to spend more time with her. He wanted to spend less time with her. Shortly after Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde's online relationship had become very sexual, Thomas informed her that he had graduated from Marine boot camp and was now on active duty, and before long, he would be shipping out to Iraq. This is when Thomas introduced to Jesse his totally made-up father and former Marine, Tom Sr. His role would be crucial to keeping the Marine Sniper fantasy alive. With the creation of Tom Sr., Thomas would be able to keep his daily connection to Jesse, who would be able to chat with Tom Sr. whenever Tommy was busy being an active duty Marine. And Tom Sr. would be able to pass her messages along to his son when Tommy eventually deployed to Iraq. In addition to speaking with Jesse every day online, either as Marine Sniper or through Marine Sniper's dad, Tom Sr., real-life Thomas also started calling 17-year-old Jesse every day of the week as he drove to and from his job at Dynabraid, claiming that those were the only times he was off duty from being a Marine. But even this added layer of connection to Jesse wasn't enough for Thomas, and in time, Thomas started to act very jealous. Whenever he noticed a new friend added to Jesse's MySpace page, MySpace was a very early social media platform, or saw that she was chatting with other people online in the public Pogo chat rooms, Thomas instantly suspected she had other boyfriends and therefore was cheating on him. And it was true that Tall Hot Blonde had become an accomplished cyber flirt and seemed to enjoy the power she had over Marine Sniper, who showed absolutely no interest in any other girls. Tall Hot Blonde and Marine Sniper had their first lover's quarrel when Thomas became convinced that Jesse was sending pictures of herself to other internet admirers. Jesse did not deny the accusation. However, she told Marine Sniper that she was devastated by what he was claiming. And so, to make Tommy feel better, she sent him a pair of her red G-string panties along with a silver Key to My Heart keychain. She sent the package to Thomas's real address. He had said that that was where his father lived and that he could forward any mail he got to Tommy wherever he was in the world. When Tommy received the panties, he forgave Jesse. However, his dad, Tom Sr., did not. Shortly after the panties arrived, Thomas, writing as Marine Sniper's father, Tom Sr., would send the 17-year-old girl a crude message calling her a bitch and accusing her of lying and trying to hurt his son. One evening, just before Christmas in December of 2005, so 7 months after first meeting Jesse on Pogo.com, Thomas once again chased his daughters off of the family computer and sat down to log into his Yahoo Instant Message account. For weeks leading up to that night, Thomas had begun talking incessantly to his coworkers at Dynabraid about how he was going to leave his wife, Cindy, and go to West Virginia to be with this new woman who had come into his life. 22-year-old Brian Barrett, who was the coworker who Thomas had overheard talking about having a Pogo account, wasn't really surprised to hear what Thomas was talking about. Brian had heard lots of the old-timers at Dynabraid going on and on about their big plans for escaping their lives. But Brian and the rest of Thomas's coworkers had no idea that Thomas's mystery woman was actually just a 17-year-old girl. As Thomas's instant messenger account loaded up on the computer, he glanced over at Cindy, who was in her usual place on the sofa watching TV. He barely noticed all of the Christmas decorations that his wife and his daughters had put up all over the living room that day. Because the only thing on Thomas's mind at that moment was what he was about to ask Jesse. He turned back to the family computer, and after exchanging a few casual messages with Jesse, Thomas got straight to the point. He told her that Tommy didn't know if he was going to make it out of Iraq alive. But before he shipped out, he wanted to marry Jesse. And would she have him? Jesse's answer came right away. Oh my God, yes, yes, she would marry her sweet, sexy Marine. The next night, when Thomas logged into his instant messenger account again, he saw excited messages from Jessie telling Marine Sniper that she was already planning their first night in bed together. It would be her first time, she told him, but she was more excited than nervous. She also told Thomas that from now on, even before they officially got married, she'd be referring to herself as Jessica Blair Montgomery. Days later, another package of Jessie's panties arrived at the Montgomery house, and along with them was a set of engraved dog tags that read Tom and Jessie, always and forever. Rationally speaking, Thomas knew that there was no way he could ever marry 17-year-old Jessie. But at the same time, he just could not accept that at some point he would have to give up not just Jessie, but Tommy, the Marine Sniper. And so, at some point, shortly after asking her to marry him, Thomas made up his mind. He decided he would find a way to marry Jessie and have a real life with her outside of the internet. And to do that, he needed to become 18-year-old Marine Sniper Tommy. And so, on January 2nd, 2006, while he was on a break at Dynabraid, he pulled out a piece of stationery with the company logo at the top and wrote a letter that was part New Year's resolution and part manifesto describing this vision he had for the future. It read, on January 2, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine. He is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life. Thomas also wrote in this strange letter that Marine Sniper had more than $2 million and would use that money to take care of Cindy and his 2 daughters, as well as help him build his new life with Jessie. At the end of this note, Thomas wrote, quote, I wish I would know the exact time I would change to new Tom so I can prepare for it. After he signed his name to this letter, Thomas folded the piece of paper up and locked it in the toolbox he kept at work. In mid-March 2006, so 2 months after Thomas penned this New Year's resolution/manifesto, one of his daughters, who was home from school and waiting for her mom and her dad to get home, was researching an assignment on the family computer when she heard a ping. Thomas had accidentally forgot to log out of his instant message account before he left for work that morning. And so the message that his daughter received came from Jessie, tall, hot blonde, and it was very sexually explicit and was clearly intended for Thomas. Thomas's daughter stared at the message, shocked. Could it really be for her father? Feeling sick, she pushed herself away from the computer and she called her mom, telling her there was something she needed to come home and look at. Hearing the strain in her daughter's voice, Cindy left work, and 15 minutes later, she was sitting at the family computer, scrolling through the hundreds of emails that her husband had written to a girl who went by the names Tall Hot Blonde and Peaches0617. Horrified, Cindy finally turned away from the computer and went upstairs and started searching through her husband's drawers and closet, where she would find a treasure trove of handwritten letters and pictures, lingerie, and a set of dog tags engraved with Tom and Jessie, always and forever. When Thomas finally pulled into the driveway that night, Cindy was waiting for him inside. As the mother of 2 teenage daughters, she could not believe that her husband had tricked and seduced a teenage girl who had never even been outside of the state of West Virginia into falling in love with an 18-year-old Marine who did not even exist. When Thomas stepped through the front door holding his car keys and lunchbox, he saw his wife standing in front of him. She looked sad and furious, and she was holding a handful of frilly girls' underwear, including a bright red G-string. Thomas knew, like a punch right to his stomach, that his wife knew his secret. And when he tried to act surprised, like he had no idea what Cindy was holding out to him, even trying to step around her into the hallway, Cindy was not convinced even for a second. Instead, she walked over to the family computer and began reciting out loud some of the lewd things Thomas had sent Jessie. Cindy told Thomas that what he was doing and what he had done was not only totally inappropriate and totally disgusting, but it was likely illegal. Jessie was a minor. And if that wasn't enough, Cindy told Thomas that his own teenage daughter had been the one to discover this raunchy affair. Cindy told her husband that he only had two options: give up this totally inappropriate, bizarre fantasy, or they could get divorced. As he stood there in stunned and guilty silence, Cindy told him that for now, he just needed to go away. Go walk the dog, go cut the grass, anything. But right now, she couldn't even stand to be near him. Thomas said nothing and turned around and walked back outside. As soon as Cindy was alone, she sat down at the kitchen table and composed a careful letter to Jesse. And as she slipped it inside of an envelope, she also enclosed a recent picture of the Montgomery family. "Let me introduce you to these people," Cindy had written. "The man in the center is Tom, my husband since 1989. He is 46 years old, and here are our two daughters, 12 and 14 years old." Cindy told Jesse that there is no Tommy, there is no Marine sniper. Cindy closed the note with a piece of advice for Jesse: do not trust the words you read on a computer. When Jesse got Cindy's letter, she was completely crushed. Before breaking off all contact with the 46-year-old man she now knew had been posing as Marine sniper, she sent Thomas a series of furious and hurt messages asking him how he could have done this to her and telling him he should have to go to jail for what he had done. For his part, Thomas, who still lived in the same house with his wife and daughters but slept in the basement, told Jesse he was sorry and that he never meant to hurt her. And Thomas told his wife Cindy that although he was totally ashamed of what he had done to her and to the family, he was relieved that she had found out, because the guilt and the stress of this double life had become an unbearable burden. And for the next 6 weeks, even though Thomas still occasionally logged onto Pogo.com to play cards, he did not hear another word from Tall Hot Blonde. But it would turn out, despite no longer communicating with Thomas, Jesse was nowhere near forgetting or forgiving what Thomas had done to her. She also began to wonder if maybe the letter she had received from Cindy was a trick. Maybe, thought Jesse, Cindy was really another girl who was also in love with Marine Sniper, and maybe Cindy had made up that whole story about Tommy being 46 years old and married with kids so that Cindy could have Tommy all to herself. Within 2 weeks of getting Cindy's letter and the picture of the Montgomery family, Jesse was back on Pogo, but this time she was looking for friends of Marine Sniper who could tell her the truth about him. On April 17th, Jesse got her answer. She had found another person online that Tommy had once mentioned to her. It was a user who went by the name Beefcake1572. He was a 22-year-old student at Buffalo State College who also worked part-time at a company called Dynabraid in upstate New York. This man's name was Brian Barrett. Again, the same Brian Barrett who Thomas had overheard talking about Pogo that had inspired Thomas to log into Pogo in the first place. And it didn't take much time in a private chat room for Tall Hot Blonde and Beefcake to put together all the pieces of the puzzle. It also didn't take long for Beefcake to fall completely in love with Tall Hot Blonde, who wasted no time sending him these same titillating pictures she had sent to Thomas. Jessie was Brian's ideal girl, blonde, beautiful, and athletic. When Beefcake confirmed that his coworker, Marine Sniper, really was 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery, and that he really did have 2 teenage daughters and a wife named Cindy, Jessie was crushed all over again. She was also very, very angry. As she and Beefcake got together in the Princess Priceless room on Pogo and played Lotso, which is a cross between bingo and the lottery, Jessie told her new admirer how hurt and heartbroken she was over Thomas's betrayal. It didn't take long for Beefcake to feel just as outraged as Jessie over the predatory and creepy behavior of this older man he once thought of as a good friend and coworker. So by the time Jessie got around to asking Beefcake if he would help her teach Thomas Montgomery a lesson, Brian, dazzled by Jessie's beauty and attention, was all in. He asked her, "What do you need me to do?" A couple weeks later, at the end of April, 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery logged onto Pogo. However, as soon as he was logged in, he got a message saying that his account had been suspended due to complaints of inappropriate activity. Stunned, Thomas logged off and started going on some of the other gaming sites he often visited outside of Pogo, and what he saw on them horrified him. On each of these other sites were forums where members of the site could post questions or offer insights or whatever they wanted to talk about, and then other people on the site could click on those individual posts and they could comment and interact with them. And when Thomas logged into each of these other gaming sites, the forum page where all these different topics are listed was the first thing he saw. And immediately, he saw his real name in several of these posts. And when he clicked on them, he saw the posts were all about how he was this 46-year-old predator and pedophile who posed as this Marine sniper. When Thomas checked to see who had written these posts, his heart sunk. They were all from either Tall Hot Blonde or Beefcake 1572, who he instantly recognized as his co-worker, Brian. Meanwhile, Jesse and Brian became closer and closer. When Jesse suggested to Brian that he tell his coworkers at Dynabraid what Thomas had done, Brian didn't waste any time. He asked Thomas's coworkers if they remembered all that talk from Thomas about him leaving his wife Cindy and moving to West Virginia to be with this new mystery woman he had met. Then Brian put out the word that the mystery woman was really a 17-year-old girl that Thomas had met online by posing as an 18-year-old Marine sniper. It didn't take long for Thomas to start seeing the dirty looks and hearing the nasty comments all around work. He was now sure that half the people at his office thought he was a loser and a predator, and parents no longer wanted him to be around their kids. Also, Brian outright told Thomas that he and Jesse were now an item, and that every time they interacted, things got hot and heavy. At home, banished to the basement and now using his own computer, Thomas sent Jesse an instant message that hinted at suicide. It said, "You can say goodbye forever to me and Tommy." At first, Jesse was glad to see the damage her revenge campaign was doing to Thomas, and it was clear that Brian was also getting a thrill out of it as well. But eventually, Jesse started to feel bad about what was happening. And in a series of text messages that started a few weeks after she and Brian had begun publicly shaming Thomas, Jesse was back in touch with Thomas, telling him how much she missed her Tommy, and that Thomas was all she had left of her, quote, sweet, sexy Marine. Maybe, she told Thomas, they could just be friends, and together they could keep the memory of Marine sniper Tommy and the passion they had shared alive. But despite Thomas agreeing to this just be friends arrangement, his relationship with Jesse pretty much immediately became very sexual and intimate again, except now it was not just Thomas and Jesse, it was Thomas, Jesse, and Brian. Despite Jesse's promise to Thomas that she would end her relationship with Brian, she didn't, and instead she began going back and forth between the two men. And so in time, the hours that she and Thomas would spend messaging each other late into the night and early morning veered crazily between declarations of love and jealous outbursts from Thomas, who kept seeing Brian's username pop up alongside Tall Hot Blonde on Pogo, other gaming sites, and on Jesse's MySpace page. Meanwhile, the tension between Thomas and Brian when they were at Dynabraid together was palpable. Thomas was furious with Brian, not only for interfering with his relationship with Jesse, but for also very publicly humiliating him. And Brian, who had developed real feelings for Jesse, had become furious with Thomas and felt like he really was a predator and a pedophile and should just go away. Thomas and Brian would openly argue and fight with each other at work, and then when they went home, they would get online and spend hours accusing each other of telling lies about their relationship with Jesse. But by mid-May, Brian was just tired of the drama. And so he told Thomas that he was just going to go to West Virginia and he was going to see Jesse in person and likely become intimate with her in person, and then she would be all his. Even though Jesse told Brian, no, do not make a trip to West Virginia, the damage to Thomas was done. From that moment forward, Thomas became obsessed with the idea that Jesse and Brian were going to take their relationship out of the cyber world, where Thomas felt like he had a chance with Jesse, into the real world, where 46-year-old Thomas stood no chance. By early September 2006, this obsession had made it impossible for Thomas to be even remotely civil with Jesse. His messages to her had become so crude and so violent that Jesse had just begun to ignore them. And when she did this, it only made Thomas more angry and more obsessed. At 10:16 p.m. on the night of September 15th, 2006, Brian clocked out of his shift at Dynabrade. It was 63 degrees Fahrenheit and cloudy outside. The quiet and the light northeast breeze were a welcome relief after the noise and bright lights inside the machine shop. As Brian walked across the nearly vacant parking lot, he kept his head down and fished his car keys out of his pocket. When he got to his white pickup truck, he polished a small smudge off the driver's side door before opening it up and hopping inside. Before Brian put his keys into the ignition, he paused and noticed that the back left side of his truck seemed to be sagging slightly. But before he could figure out why it was doing that, he noticed off to his left in his peripheral vision, a shadowy figure was moving across the lot toward him. 2 days later, early on Monday morning, September 18th, Clarence, New York police got a 911 call from the security guard at the Dynabrade equipment factory. He just found the body of a young man who'd been shot dead at close range inside of his white truck that was parked in the Dynabrade parking lot. By the time the police arrived, so too had the first shift of Dynabrade workers. As the police set up a perimeter around the crime scene, co-workers stood by in total disbelief. Based on interviews with Brian's family who had not seen him all weekend, and with his co-workers who identified his truck and his body, along with records that showed when Brian had last left the Dynabrade factory, it only took police a few hours to come up with a preliminary theory about what had happened. Whoever killed Brian must have taken the young man by surprise. Brian sat slumped in the driver's seat of the truck, leaning slightly towards his right, away from the closed window with the 3 bullet holes punched through it. There were bullet wounds in his upper left arm and jaw, and a gaping hole in the left side of his neck. Police noticed that Brian's back left tire on his truck was flat, and when they checked, they saw someone had punctured it with a knife. Also, a .30 caliber carbine rifle shell casing, as well as a peach pit, were discovered at the scene of the crime. Brian's family was devastated. They had absolutely no idea who might have wanted to harm their eldest child. When police interviewed Brian's parents, neither of them were aware of any problems or arguments that Brian was having at home, at school, or at work. But once police began interviewing Brian's co-workers at Dynabrade that Monday morning, they heard a very different story. It seemed to be common knowledge that Brian had had a serious falling out with a co-worker who had been acting more and more erratically in recent weeks. That co-worker's name was Thomas Montgomery, and it seemed like the two men had both been involved in an online relationship with the same woman, except she wasn't really a woman, she was actually a 17-year-old girl. Unable to locate Thomas, police were concerned, if he really was the killer, that Jessie, the 17-year-old girl, could be in danger. So police in New York went through Brian's cell phone and found contact information for Jessie, and then contacted authorities in Oak Hill, West Virginia, and asked them to do a welfare check on the girl. But before the West Virginia police could conduct that check, detectives in New York got in touch with Thomas and pulled him in for questioning. Thomas denied that he had anything to do with Brian's murder, saying that he had been at a local restaurant the night before and had arrived home sometime between maybe 10 or 10:10 p.m., which meant he would have been home when Brian was still alive and inside the Dynabrade factory. Thomas would admit to police that yes, he and Brian both did meet the same girl online, Jessie, and they had been squabbling over her. But Thomas said he would never hurt Brian. But it wasn't until investigators in New York heard back from police in West Virginia and tracked down additional cell phone data and spoke with Cindy Montgomery that they were able to piece together who had really killed Brian and why. At 1:33 a.m. on September 13th, 2006, so 2 days before Brian was killed, Jessie heard the ping of an incoming instant message. When she looked at her computer screen, she saw that it was from Thomas. It said, "You're a whore, and that's all you ever will be." For weeks, ever since Brian had told Thomas that he planned to drive to West Virginia to see Jessie in person, Thomas's messages to Jessie had become extremely abusive. Jessie had tried to calm him down, to get him to become, once again, her sweet, sexy Marine sniper named Tommy, but it just wasn't working. And so now, seeing this new message come across, Jessie took up a new strategy. She began ignoring him. And this drove Thomas mad. A day later, on September 14th, Jesse heard the ping of yet another incoming message, asking her if she planned to have sex with one of her boyfriends that day. Again, Jesse just ignored him. A day after that, early on the morning of Friday, September 15th, the day Brian was killed, Thomas woke Jesse up with a phone call, screaming at her in an uncontrollable rage. She hung up on him. Thomas Montgomery had reached a mental tipping point. On one hand, he knew that he could never really have a real life with Jesse. He also knew that his jealousy and rage were getting out of control. But the same part of him that had written out that New Year's resolution/manifesto back on January 2nd, 2006, felt that he still possessed somewhere inside the young Marine sniper whom Jesse had loved and who represented to Thomas the best version of himself. And so on September 15th, after screaming at Jesse on the phone and hearing the click as she hung up on him, Thomas made up his mind. He had waited long enough for his transformation from middle-aged machinist with a wife and 2 daughters into that battle-hardened Marine sniper who could and would defend what was his. That evening, Thomas told his wife, Cindy, that he was going to go out to dinner by himself. Once outside in his car, he looked in the back seat to make sure his supplies were all there. Then he turned on his car and drove to a fast food place near Dynabraid. After eating, Thomas left the restaurant and drove the short distance to Dynabraid. Entering the parking lot behind the factory, Thomas chose a parking space that was far away from the door where he knew Brian would exit. After his car was parked, Thomas climbed out of his vehicle. He was glad it was cloudy, and he was glad that the parking lot where he now stood was almost empty except for Brian's white pickup truck. Thomas finally finished eating his peach and dropped the pit onto the parking lot pavement. Now, as a Marine sniper, Thomas had to get the timing of this mission exactly right. He needed to get close enough to the truck to take his kill shots before Brian had a chance to drive away, but he also had to let Brian get into the truck without giving away his own position. And on his way in for the kill, he needed to make a silent puncture with his knife in the back left tire. This was his insurance policy. In case Brian did see him, it would make it very difficult for him to escape. Just after 10:16 p.m., the factory door opened and Brian walked outside into the parking lot. Brian didn't even look up as he walked towards his truck. To Thomas, what he was about to do almost seemed too easy. As soon as Brian had climbed into the truck and closed the driver's side door, Thomas was there like a shadow. And a second later, he had fired 3 shots through the closed window. Even through the blood spatter on the inside of the car window, he saw the massive hole in Brian's neck and knew that he was dead or was definitely going to die. Backing away from the truck, Thomas quickly returned to his own car, not realizing that he had dropped one of his shell casings. On his drive back to his house, Brian hoped his wife and daughters would be asleep. That way no one could contradict him when he said he'd gotten home that night before Brian had actually left the factory. But when police did interview Cindy a few days later, she would tell them that it was her recollection that her husband had not arrived home on the night of Brian's murder before 10:16 p.m. Cindy estimated that it was closer to 10:45 p.m. or later. And when police arrived at Dynabraid to question Thomas, he made a remark that instantly connected him in the minds of investigators to the peach pit they had found at the scene of Brian's murder. Thomas asked police if they could wait just a minute before questioning him so he could get the peaches he'd brought in for lunch out of his car so they wouldn't spoil in the sun. Although Thomas refused to give police a DNA sample, the police were able to pick up his DNA from a can of soda, and they found that it matched the DNA on the peach pit they'd found at the murder scene. A search of Thomas's house did not turn up a .30 caliber carbine rifle, but it did turn up an old photo of Thomas's gun cabinet that contained the exact same gun. Thomas's computer told investigators the rest of the story. In thousands of messages and emails to Jesse and Brian, coupled with his collection of Jesse's lingerie and other gifts, Thomas detailed his obsession with Jesse and his jealousy and growing hatred for Brian. Later, police would also discover the letter that Thomas had written that he kept locked in his toolkit at work. It was his New Year's resolution/manifesto that described wanting to leave 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery behind and become instead his 18-year-old alter ego, Marine sniper Tommy. On November 27, 2006, 2 months after Brian's death, police arrested Thomas and charged him with murder. And it was at this time that Thomas learned he was not the only person pretending to be someone else online. When West Virginia law enforcement arrived at Jessie's house to do that welfare check on her, her mother arrived at the door. When police told her that her daughter, Jessie, was in danger following the murder of a man she had likely been involved with online, the woman was shocked and told them that Jessie was not home. When police told her that they really needed to get in touch with her immediately and go get her in their own vehicles if necessary, the mother suddenly broke down and started crying, and then told police that she really did have a daughter named Jessie. But that was not the Jessie they were looking for. She, the mother, a slightly overweight 46-year-old housewife with short brown hair, whose real name was Mary Sheeler, was the 17-year-old girl, tall, hot blonde. It would turn out, for more than 16 months, Mary Sheeler had used her daughter's real identity to enter into multiple online relationships with men, sending them, just as she had sent Thomas and Brian, hundreds of pictures of the real Jessie, her daughter. When investigators asked her why she did this, Mary said she had joined Pogo to relax and kill time. After that, she enjoyed the drama and power and attention she got from manipulating the emotions of her many online admirers, none of whom she loved. In fact, she told investigators she was happily married to her husband of 23 years and was very devoted to her daughter, who had no idea any of this was happening and was off at college. But all that would change when the real 18-year-old Jessie discovered her own pictures and name all over the internet, along with details of how her own mother used her identity as bait for a catfishing scheme that left one man dead, one in prison, and 2 families in ruins. When police arrived at the jail and showed Thomas Montgomery a picture of the real tall, hot blonde, 46-year-old Mary Sheeler, the color from his face drained. Then, without saying a word, he turned around and faced the wall. He would eventually plead guilty and would be sentenced to 20 years in prison. There were no charges that could be brought against Mary Sheeler for catfishing, but her husband would divorce her, and her daughter, Jessie, would sever all ties with her. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, just as the 5-star review button is about to blow out the candles on their birthday cake, lean in and blow them out yourself. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hey fans of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, today's episode is a fan favorite. It comes from episode number 72, which is titled Debbie's Last Dance. In 1982, a young woman walked up a flight of stairs to her friend's apartment and knocked on the door. But as she did, she noticed the little window on the door was broken. Worried something was wrong with her friend, the woman knocked again, this time a little louder, while also now peering through the broken window to see if she could see anything inside. However, she couldn't, but she could hear music playing inside her friend's apartment. After another minute went by and still her friend did not come to the door, the woman tried the door handle and found that it was open. With her heart racing, the woman slowly opened the door and stepped inside. And a few seconds later, she would see something in that apartment that was so horrible, it would send her sprinting back outside. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the 5-star review button's lip balm with super glue. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. 21-year-old Debbie Carter looked around at the Tuesday night crowd in the Coachlight nightclub where she worked part-time as a waitress. All her tables were taken care of, and the rush of after-work customers had ended at least an hour ago. Grateful for what looked like it would be an extended lull in business, Debbie leaned against the bar, already looking forward to the end of her shift when she could finally get off her feet. As though reading Debbie's mind, Debbie's high school friend and Coachlight regular, Gina Vieta, caught Debbie's attention from across the room, where Gina and some friends were sitting at a table pushed up against the far side of the metal building. As soon as their eyes met, Gina raised her beer bottle in Debbie's direction and then pointed at the seat next to her before mouthing, "Come join us." Debbie gave her old high school friend a big smile, then she checked with the bartender to see if he had any more drinks that she needed to serve. And when he shook his head no, Debbie turned around and then tracked down her boss to see if she could officially go off the clock to go hang out with Gina and their friends. Like the bartender, Debbie's boss didn't have anything for her to do, and so he quickly smiled and said, "Go have fun." Not only was Debbie hardworking, but she was also popular with customers, and she was good at handling any unwanted attention or advances in a way that was direct but not confrontational. So Debbie's boss, who couldn't ask for a better employee, was glad to give Debbie a little break. As Debbie grabbed a beer and walked over to join her friends, the bouncer made a mental note to make sure that Debbie got safely to her car when the Coachlight closed later that night. And that, in a nutshell, was the town of Ada, Oklahoma. It was a tight-knit community. People knew each other, and people looked out for each other, and a lot of people in town didn't even bother to lock their doors, at least when they left their houses during the day. As for the Coachlight, on that night, December 7th, 1982, the popular local watering hole was a perfect example of how the town as a whole had held on to those deep-rooted small-town values despite the huge social and economic changes of the last 8 decades. Gone were the oil gushers and the huge deposits of petroleum and natural gas that had put Oklahoma on the map back in the early 1900s. And while Ada was still home to some small oil rigs that were still operating, most of the rigs in and around the town were rusted and derelict. Since the 1950s, when Oklahoma started emptying out more oil and gas reserves than it was discovering, the town of 15,000 residents had mostly turned from oil to other industries that paid by the hour, like work on pecan farms and in factories and feed mills. But as the county seat of Pontotoc County and one of the larger towns in rural southeast Oklahoma, Ada was still busy. People were no longer making overnight fortunes on oil, but the town was known nationally for horse breeding and for top-of-the-line horse sales that drew customers from all over the country. Ada's courthouse and jail, as well as the town's lawyers and police force, were also busy. They had plenty to do trying to keep up with the ravages caused by the local methamphetamine drug epidemic that had hit so many towns in rural Oklahoma. But even in the face of these changes, Ada was holding its own. A lot of local businesses had moved to the edges of the town, but Main Street was still doing okay. There were no boarded-up storefronts, and neighbors and coworkers gathered for lunch in cafes and sandwich shops. The town was also home to East Central University, whose 4,000 students, a lot of them commuters, helped boost the local economy and bring a little diversity to Ada's mostly white and mostly Christian population. And places like the Coachlight, with its cheap beer, along with food that was more filling than it was fancy, did very well, especially on weekends when it was filled with a mix of factory workers, 20-somethings, and a dance and party crowd who went there for the live music and the big dance floor. On her way over to Gina's table, Debbie had to slow down a couple of times to say hi to a few of the regulars. Even though it wasn't a busy night, there were more than a dozen people at the Coachlight who knew Debbie by name or who had gone to school with her. And noticing that she had stepped away from work, a few of the men decided then and there to see if they could get Debbie out on the dance floor before closing time. Because Debbie was one of those very easy-to-like people. It wasn't just that she was attractive and athletic, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall before pulling on her work boots. She also had an open smile and friendly dark eyes that matched the color of her glossy shoulder-length dark brown hair. In addition to her part-time job at the Coachlight, Debbie babysat, she worked part-time at the local glass plant, and she served food at a local drugstore lunch counter. As a child and teenager, Debbie had never been a huge fan of academics, and her father, Charlie Carter, still liked to tell the story about how Debbie, on her second ever day of going to school, had looked up at her parents and asked, "You mean I've really got to go through with this?" So instead of going on to college after graduating from Ada High School in 1979, Debbie had put all her energy into saving money to buy her own car and rent an apartment of her own. It was a goal that meant she had sometimes clashed with her mom, Peggy Stillwell, who felt that Debbie was spending too much time at places like the Coach Light and drinking too many beers with old high school buddies like Gina. But 2 months ago, Debbie's dream of living on her own, a big girl life, as her family called it, had come true. That's when Debbie had packed her belongings into the 1975 Oldsmobile car she had bought with her own money and moved into her very own 3-room apartment above a garage at 1022 East 8th Street, right next to the campus of East Central University. Once Debbie's mom was satisfied that Debbie had chosen what seemed like a safe location to live alone, Peggy had given her blessing to Debbie, and mom and daughter were right back to being as close as they had always been. And that closeness was true of Debbie's relationship with her father, too. Even though Debbie's parents had divorced 5 years ago, both Peggy and Charlie shared a bond of unconditional love for Debbie and her 2 younger sisters. And since Charlie sometimes picked up a shift as a bouncer at the Coach Light, he was able to keep a protective eye on his daughter without being intrusive. Now, slipping into the seat at the Coach Light next to Gina and a group of their other old high school friends, Debbie stretched out her long legs under the table and sighed with contentment. It had been a long day, and just sitting down was a relief. But even as Debbie exchanged greetings with her friends, her mind drifted to her new home. And just thinking about the apartment she had worked so hard for gave Debbie a thrill. She'd always been someone who liked her independence, and now that she had a place of her own, she loved keeping her cozy living room, kitchen, and bedroom absolutely spotless. And with no one to look over her shoulder, she could eat as many mayonnaise sandwiches, a personal favorite of hers, as often as she wanted to. Even the things Debbie didn't have turned out to be an advantage. As Peggy pointed out, the fact that Debbie did not have her own washer and dryer was actually a blessing. It meant that Debbie made regular trips to her mom's house to do her laundry, which is exactly where Debbie had been just 2 evenings earlier, listening to the tumble of the dryer while she curled up on the bed next to her mom, which is where Debbie wound up falling asleep and spending that night. Peggy, whose motherly instincts were always on high alert, still couldn't help but worry about her daughter's safety in her new apartment. But Debbie had always said, "Mom, as long as I have my teeth and nails to fight with, no one is going to hurt me." Debbie's thoughts were suddenly pulled back to the present when one of her high school acquaintances stopped by the table and asked her to dance. Debbie had always had her share of boyfriends, but she'd never been known for sleeping around. In fact, her closest girlfriends knew that Debbie was very modest and shy when it came to letting anyone see her undressed. But this was someone Debbie had known for a long time that was asking her to dance, and even though she was tired, she pushed herself up from her chair and headed out to the dance floor. But by the time Debbie had come back and ordered another beer, she was already glancing at her watch, just waiting for the night to end so she could go back home. That moment came a little sooner than she expected when her boss started closing the Coach Light early at around 12:30 a.m. Gina immediately invited everyone at their table back to her apartment for one more drink, but Debbie smiled and shook her head. No, Debbie was going to head straight home to her apartment. She promised Gina that if she changed her mind, she'd give her a call. As customers made their way back to their cars, the bouncer made sure that Debbie was not walking out of the nightclub on her own. And after having a brief conversation through her car window with another Coach Light regular, Debbie rolled up her car window, turned on the car engine, and drove out of the Coach Light parking lot towards her new home. At 2:30 a.m. on the morning of December 8th, 2 hours after the Coach Light closed its doors and turned off the lights, Gina heard the ring of her telephone cut through the noise of the people talking and laughing over drinks at her apartment. When she answered her phone, she was surprised to hear Debbie's voice on the other end. She was even more surprised by what Debbie was asking Gina to do. According to Debbie, there was a visitor in Debbie's apartment who was making Debbie uncomfortable, and Debbie wanted Gina to drive over and give Debbie a ride to Gina's house. Since Debbie had her own car and could drive to Gina's house, the request made no sense to Gina, unless Debbie's visitor wasn't letting Debbie leave. Gina tried to ask Debbie who the visitor was, but their conversation was cut short by muffled noises on Debbie's end. Gina heard Debbie talking to someone, and then the sounds of what might have been a struggle over control of the phone. Gina didn't wait to hear anything else. She sensed something was wrong. Before hanging up the phone, Gina told Debbie that she would be there as soon as she could. But before Gina even made it out the door, her phone rang again, and again the caller was Debbie. But now Debbie sounded much calmer and told Gina not to come get Debbie after all and that everything was actually okay. Debbie did ask Gina to please give Debbie a call later that morning to make sure Debbie was awake. After hanging up the phone a second time, Gina's first impulse was to ignore Debbie's second call and just still drive over to her apartment to make sure she was okay. But by the time Gina had made it out to her car, she was already having second thoughts. Even though it seemed unlikely, if Debbie did have a man over for the night, Gina didn't want to barge in on them. And Debbie had seemed very emphatic on that second call, telling Gina not to come over. So even though Gina had almost reached her car, she slowed down and then reversed course. A few minutes later, she was back inside of her own apartment, where her friends that had come over were now starting to gather their coats and leave. When Gina woke up later that morning, she completely forgot to call Debbie and check in with her. At 11:20 a.m. on December 8th, that same morning, Donna Johnson headed up the narrow wooden stairway to Debbie's apartment on East 8th Street. An old high school friend of Debbie's, Donna now lived an hour away in Shawnee, but she was back in Ada for the day to visit her parents and to catch up with old friends like Debbie. But just as Donna reached the tiny landing outside of Debbie's front door and had already raised her hand to knock, she felt bits of broken glass grinding under her shoe. And at the same time, Donna registered the fact that the little window in Debbie's door was broken. Even as Donna did reach up and start knocking on the door, she heard the faint sound of a radio playing inside of Debbie's apartment. When there was no answer to her second knock on the door, Donna checked the doorknob and realized that the door was unlocked. As soon as Donna stepped inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. The living room in front of her was a mess. The sofa cushions were scattered on the floor, and strewn across the linoleum in the kitchen off to her side, Donna saw a woman's blouse and a pair of jeans. Even as Donna started to step past the mess towards Debbie's bedroom, she took in the sight of words scrawled in red on the living room walls and on the small white table in the kitchen. But nothing could have prepared Donna for what she saw next. Lying face down on the floor of the bedroom on the far side of the bed, nude except for one sock, lay Debbie's bloody and lifeless body. The bed had been shoved away from the wall, and all the covers were pulled off of it. On Debbie's back, Donna saw more words written in red liquid. Stumbling backwards in horror, Donna suddenly realized that whoever had done this to Debbie might still be hidden inside of the apartment, and a minute later, Donna was clattering back down the stairs outside. Hopping into her car, Donna drove to the nearest payphone to call Debbie's mother, Peggy, who in turn quickly called her ex-husband, Charlie. Charlie arrived at his daughter's apartment ahead of the police and medical personnel. In Debbie's bedroom, Charlie fell to his knees next to his daughter's body. Charlie called Debbie's name twice before gently lifting one of his daughter's shoulders so he could look at her face. A bloody washcloth was stuffed deep into Debbie's mouth. Minutes later, the street in front of Debbie's apartment was lined with police cars, a wailing ambulance, and law enforcement. Stepping into Debbie's apartment bedroom, Ada police detective Dennis Smith took one look at Debbie's body and knew that he had a brutal rape and homicide on his hands. As the 17-year veteran of the Ada Police Department took in the horrific details of how Debbie had died, he also knew that this case felt intensely personal. In addition to knowing Debbie's parents, Charlie and Peggy, Detective Smith's own daughter was good friends with Debbie's younger sister. Doing his best to keep his emotions under control, the 39-year-old detective immediately ordered officers to seal off the immediate area around the apartment from the growing crowd of neighbors and bystanders. After clearing the inside of the apartment, Detective Smith did not waste any time. He sent police officers out to knock on doors and interview neighbors to see if anyone saw or heard anything unusual during the night and early morning hours. He also wanted a list of Debbie's friends, boyfriends, co-workers, family members, and possible enemies. Police would soon find out from Debbie's friend Gina about the 2 phone calls Debbie had made between 2:30 and 3 a.m. that morning, and based on that testimony, they would quickly narrow the time of the murder to some time between 2:30 a.m. and 11:40 a.m. when Donna had discovered Debbie's body. With that information in hand, Detective Smith was especially interested in knowing exactly who saw or interacted with Debbie on the night of December 8th and into the early morning hours of December 9th at the coach light. Since that could include a list of dozens of people, Detective Smith also pushed out a general request for the male patrons of the Coachlight the night before, as well as any male acquaintances of Debbie's, to come to the police station and voluntarily submit hair, pubic hair, and saliva samples. Satisfied that the investigation was now underway, Detective Smith stepped back and tried to make sense of the crime scene, in which all 3 rooms of Debbie's apartment appear to have been upended by a struggle between Debbie and her attacker. In fact, starting with the shattered front door window and ending with the ripped and torn trail of clothing and furniture, the apartment was so trashed that Detective Smith realized that this homicide might be the work of more than one perpetrator. That suspicion grew stronger as the detective looked at the 4 messages that the killer or killers had left behind. Written in nail polish on the wall of the den was the sentence, "Jim Smith will die next." On Debbie's back, written in what would turn out to be ketchup, Detective Smith read the name Duke Graham. Once Debbie's body was turned over, the detective would see a single word written in red fingernail polish on Debbie's chest, "Die." And on the kitchen table, written in ketchup again, was a message that referred explicitly to 2 killers. "Don't look for us, or else." The names Jim Smith and Duke Graham were both familiar to Ada police. Duke was a local nightclub owner, and Jim was a local small-time criminal that Duke had once driven out of his bar with a shotgun. As Detective Smith, no relation to Jim Smith, completed his examination of Debbie's apartment, he sent officers to find out where both those men were and bring them in for questioning. Then, the detective watched for a few minutes as crime scene techs went about their work inside the apartment, dusting for fingerprints and photographing and collecting possible evidence. That evidence included any strands of human hair, the murder weapon, and the removal of a 4x4-inch square of sheetrock from the bedroom wall that contained a single bloody handprint. The next day, Thursday, December 9th, at 3 p.m., the autopsy of Debbie's body would confirm that she had been raped before she died. Detective Smith was joined at that autopsy by agents from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation who had offered their help and support to local law enforcement. The men watched as the medical examiner collected samples of hair from Debbie's body, as well as scrapings from under Debbie's fingernails, clippings from which were also carefully entered and tagged as evidence. By this point, more than a dozen men had already come forward to the police station to deliver their DNA samples to the police. And it was clear to Detective Smith in interacting with these guys that he was not the only person in Ada who was personally upset by Debbie's murder. One of the first people that police interviewed was a guy named Glenn Gore, who was one of Debbie's old high school classmates who had been with her at the Coachlight before she was killed. And he, like the other friends who had been with Debbie that night, was very shaken up and just could not understand who would want to harm Debbie. And over the next few days, police would hear testimony that sounded a lot like Glenn's. No one seemed to have any idea who would want to harm Debbie. And within days of the murder, police had confirmed that neither Graham Duke or Jim Smith could have been involved in the killing. Graham had an ironclad alibi, and Jim was locked up in state prison. By the morning of Debbie's funeral on Saturday, December 11th, 3 days after her murder, townspeople's fear and frustration only got more intense as mourners filed past Debbie's open casket, because all the makeup in the world could not disguise the terrible injuries to the young woman's swollen and badly beaten face, and whoever had done that was still out walking the streets. Meanwhile, investigators were frustrated by the fact that they had to wait for results from the state's crime lab. Investigators knew that a key piece of physical evidence in the case was the bloody handprint that had been collected from the wall of Debbie's apartment. If that print did not belong to Debbie, it had to belong to someone else who was in the room when Debbie was killed, and that person would most likely be Debbie's murderer. But in the face of growing public pressure to solve a case that was quickly showing signs of getting cold, Detective Smith and Ada's prosecuting attorney, Bill Peterson, decided they could not wait until the Oklahoma State Crime Lab ID'd that print. Instead, in early March of 1983, 3 months after Debbie's death, investigators zeroed in on 2 brand new suspects. This new direction in the investigation was based on unsubstantiated rumors about the murder that were circulating in the local county jail. The first and primary suspect was 30-year-old Ron Williamson, a former minor league baseball player who was one of Ada's well-known hellraisers and heavy drinkers. Ron, who lived not far from Debbie's garage apartment, was fingered as a possible suspect by his county jail cellmate when Ron was locked up on a drunk driving conviction. According to his cellmate, when news of Debbie's murder spread through the inmate population, Ron, who was also known to have serious mental health issues, became very upset. The second suspect, a 23-year-old man named Dennis Fritz, who was new to Ada but who had been seen in Ron's company at some local bars, was a person of interest mostly because police believed the murder had been committed by two men, and Dennis was one of Ron's few friends. Both men were interviewed repeatedly by police, and both denied any involvement in Debbie's murder. They also submitted fingerprints and DNA to police. Eventually, after hours of aggressive questioning from investigators, Dennis was told he failed a lie detector test, and Ron was told that the results of the lie detector test he had agreed to take were inconclusive. But even after the Oklahoma State Crime Lab reported back to Ada police on March 28, 1983, that the bloody handprint on the wall of Debbie's bedroom did not match prints belonging to Debbie, Dennis, or Ron, Ada law enforcement did just the opposite of backing off that avenue of investigation. Instead, they began to focus exclusively on Ron and Dennis. Neither man had been seen on the night of the murder at the Coach Light, but without any other suspects in the case, Ada investigators doubled down on building a circumstantial case against the men. The case was based mostly on Ron's history and reputation in Ada as unpredictable, occasionally violent, and at times mentally unstable, as well as allegations from more jailhouse informants saying that Ron had had a dream about Debbie's murder. The police continued to focus on Dennis based on their conviction that the crime had been committed by more than one person. In December of 1983, Detective Smith's case against Ron was suddenly strengthened when a customer who had been at the Coach Light on the night before Debbie's murder came forward and told police they had seen Ron at the nightclub that night, just hours before Debbie would be killed. But it wouldn't be until May 1st, 1986, 4.5 years after Debbie's murder, that Ada police got the information they felt they needed to clear the way for an arrest and conviction in the homicide case that had slowly poisoned the once safe and tight-knit little town of Ada, Oklahoma. That was when Ada's district attorney, Bill Peterson, persuaded Debbie's mother, Peggy Stillwell, to allow police to dig up Debbie's body and re-examine her handprint to see if maybe it did match the bloody print that police found on her wall. If investigators could somehow prove that the bloody print on Debbie's bedroom wall actually did belong to Debbie, then police would no longer have to find a suspect whose print matched that one on the wall. And sure enough, after taking prints from the hand of a 4-year-old corpse, the same agent who had earlier declared that the print on the wall did not match Debbie's prints now revised his report to say that it was inconclusive whose print was on the wall. That shadow of a doubt was all police needed. Combined with a hair analysis showing that some of the head hairs found at Debbie's apartment bore a microscopic resemblance to samples provided by Ron and Dennis, Detective Smith and District Attorney Bill Peterson were sure they had solved the case. 1 week later, on May 8, 1986, Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz were arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Debbie Carter. For Debbie's family and many other residents of Ada, Ron's arrest came as a relief. Ever since he was first questioned by police back in early 1983, Ron's mental health had deteriorated. His mood swings were more extreme, his behavior had become even more erratic and at times violent. And he had spent all 4 of those years since Debbie's murder in and out of jail on charges ranging from forging a check worth $300 to violating parole to public intoxication. Meanwhile, the long wait for justice had just about destroyed Debbie's mother, Peggy, who had begun to drink heavily and spend hours and hours sitting near her oldest daughter's grave in nearby Rosedale Cemetery. And so, in April of 1988, both Ron and Dennis were convicted in separate trials of Debbie's murder, and the town of Ada breathed a collective sigh of relief. Dennis was sentenced to life in prison, and Ron was sentenced to death. The actual date of Ron's execution was set for September 27, 1994. Ron and his court-appointed attorney would have 6 years to file appeals. Finally, after more than 6 years, Debbie's family could begin to heal, and Debbie, now buried for a second time, could finally be left in peace. As the spring of 1988 blossomed in Ada, the town of 15,000 residents could sleep easier knowing that Debbie's killers were safely behind bars. But all that would change 6 years later on September 22, 1994. Exactly 5 days before Ron Williamson was scheduled to die by lethal injection, a federal appeals judge shocked Ada law enforcement by ordering a stay of execution. The ruling was based on an appeal by Ron's lawyer outlining violations of Ron's constitutional rights during his 1987 trial. But even though that same judge would eventually grant Ron's request for a new trial, the tip that wound up cracking the case of Debbie Carter's rape and murder wide open would have nothing to do with legal arguments about police work. In early 1999, while Dennis was still serving a life sentence and Ron was still in prison awaiting his new trial, Ada's district attorney, Bill Peterson, received a phone call with news so stunning it would place Ada at ground zero of a national media blitz that would reverberate throughout the town and the Oklahoma judicial system for decades to come. Based on that new information and follow-up work by local investigators and agents from the Oklahoma State Department of Investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Debbie Carter on the night of December 7th and in the early morning hours of Wednesday, December 8th, 1982. It was a slow night at the Coachlight nightclub, and 21-year-old part-time waitress Debbie Carter was grateful that her boss had let her go off the clock. Now she looked around the table at her group of friends, which included Gina, a Coachlight regular who had asked Debbie to take off her work apron and join them for a couple of beers. On her way over to Gina's table an hour earlier, Debbie had done her usual inventory of Coachlight customers. She'd waitressed at enough bars that it was second nature now to read the room for any signs of trouble from difficult or rowdy patrons. Town bad boy Ron Williamson was not there, and it had been weeks since his friend, Dennis Fritz, had stopped by. Ron was 8 years older than Debbie was, and all she really knew about him and his friend was that they liked to play guitar and that Ron had once been a very popular and promising kid who went on to play minor league baseball for the New York Yankees before an injury had ended his career. Debbie was glad Ron wasn't at the Coachlight. You serve him a couple of drinks and he could get loud and aggressive, and she'd heard that at least one woman back in 1978 had accused him of rape, although Debbie had also heard that those charges were eventually dismissed. But there was still one person at the Coachlight that night that Debbie wished wasn't there. She'd felt his eyes following her when she crossed the room serving drinks, and again when she had walked over to Gina's table. He'd even come over and asked Debbie to dance. She had agreed, they'd gone to school together and they had known each other for years, but when he'd gotten so persistent out there on the dance floor, pressing in way too close to her, she'd actually had to push him away and leave him standing out there alone. When the Coachlight closed early at 12:20 a.m., and Debbie had declined Gina's offer to go to Gina's place for one more drink, there her creepy dance partner was again. This time, he was insisting on walking her to her car out in the parking lot. Debbie had told Mike, the bouncer that night, that this was one of her high school classmates who actually kind of scared her. And when this classmate stood outside of her car and tried to talk to her through her car window, Debbie was glad to see Mike kind of slow down on his way to his own car to make sure Debbie was okay. Seeing her chance, Debbie waved at Mike and then rolled up her car window, turned on her car engine, and drove out of the parking lot, once again leaving her old high school classmate, her creepy dance partner, standing there all alone. Getting dumped like that did not sit well with Debbie's killer, but he knew where Debbie lived, and he'd made up his mind to drop by her place later that night. A few hours later, Debbie's killer was walking the last few blocks of the way to Debbie's new apartment on East 8th Street. He was relieved to see a light on in the rooms above the garage, and a few minutes later, he had walked up the set of wooden stairs to the small landing outside of Debbie's front door. When Debbie's face appeared in the small glass window, her killer took a step back and put on his most reassuring smile. He could see Debbie did not look happy to see him, but he made the most of her few seconds of hesitation, calling to her through the closed door that he just wanted to say hello. It was a cold night, please just let him inside for a few minutes. And just as he had hoped, Debbie did exactly that. Except that Debbie's killer did not leave after a few minutes. And when Debbie picked up the phone and called Gina and asked Gina to drive over and get Debbie and take her to Gina's house, it was all Debbie's killer could do. First, to interrupt the conversation before Debbie gave Gina his name, and then to persuade Debbie to call Gina back and say that everything with Debbie was okay after all. But the whole episode with the phone and Debbie's earlier refusal to have sex with him, which is what he wanted and what he'd come there for, made Debbie's killer very angry. Instead of leaving, which is what he'd just promised Debbie he would do, he waited until Debbie had turned away from him to show him to the door before grabbing her from behind and spinning her back around to face him. When the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Debbie's body 2 days later, at 3 p.m. on the afternoon of December 9th, the catalog of wounds and injuries she had suffered, all inflicted before her actual death, told the story of the violent struggle between Debbie and her killer in the early morning hours of December 8th. Over the course of the assault, Debbie would be beaten, stripped, and raped. In trying to fight off her attacker, Debbie would sustain bruises, scrapes, and small cuts on her arms, hands, face, under her chin, and on the back of her head, along with bruises and bite marks inside her mouth and on her tongue. At some point, Debbie's attacker would shove a bloody washcloth down her throat, and there were traces of shampoo as well as ketchup left on her back and buttocks. In addition to the electrical cord that Debbie's father would see wrapped around his daughter's neck, Charlie would also see the beautiful leather belt that Debbie's mother had given Debbie for her 21st birthday, a belt that had now been used to strangle their oldest daughter. The medical examiner would confirm asphyxiation, lack of oxygen, was the ultimate cause of Debbie's death. After the killer had squeezed the last breath of air out of his victim, he sat straddling Debbie's body for a few moments so he could catch his breath. Then he pushed himself back onto his feet and collected and adjusted his clothing before turning his attention to Debbie's apartment. According to an expert in crime scene reconstruction, Debbie's killer would have spent a substantial amount of time staging the crime scene to make it look like the attack had been the work of more than one person. And Debbie's killer would also use the messages he wrote on Debbie's back and chest, as well as on the walls and kitchen table in her apartment, to divert police attention to two other men, Duke Graham and Jim Smith, who were already known to Ada law enforcement. Once he was satisfied with his work, Debbie's killer took a final look around, then stepped to the door of Debbie's ruined apartment. Before leaving, he carefully broke the glass window in the center of the door, so there were bits of glass both inside the apartment as well as outside on the landing. Pulling the unlocked door closed behind him, the killer walked down the wooden stairway out into the cold Oklahoma night air. Later that day, Debbie's killer would go to the Ada police station along with the dozens of other men in town, and he would tell police that he did see Debbie the night before at the coach light, but he had no idea what happened to her. And unlike the 44 other men who would come to the Ada police station over the next days and hours and weeks, Debbie's killer managed to go to the police station but slip away without giving his fingerprints and without submitting samples of his saliva and hair. He would also change his statement 1 year later and tell police that on the night of December 7th, he had seen Ron Williamson at the coach light, and that when the killer had walked Debbie out to her car just after the coach light closed at 12:30 a.m. on December 8th, Debbie had confided to him that she was afraid of Ron. Later still, at Ron's trial in 1988, Debbie's killer would be the star witness whose testimony to that effect would help put both Ron and Dennis behind bars, Ron facing the death penalty and Dennis facing life in prison. It wouldn't be until April of 1999, 11 years after Ron and Dennis were convicted, that advances in forensic science and the real killer's own criminal history would finally catch up with him. Because even as Ron Williamson was filing the legal appeals that would result in a stay of execution just 5 days before he was scheduled to die and the granting of a new trial, Dennis Fritz had been working tirelessly to get a new analysis done of all the DNA evidence that had been collected at the scene of Debbie's murder back in 1982. And by early 1999, Dennis was finally successful. And on January 26th and 27th, new tests conducted by Laboratory Corporation of America showed that none of the semen samples collected at the crime scene and from Debbie's body matched samples given by Ron and Dennis. Later, tests on the 17 hair samples that had also been collected at the crime scene, including one strand with a hair follicle still attached, also excluded Ron and Dennis as Debbie's killer. Meanwhile, even though Debbie's killer had literally gotten away with murder on December 8, 1982, by 1987, he was behind bars serving a 40-year sentence for robbery, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. And in 1995, the state of Oklahoma began taking blood samples from every one of its prison inmates, analyzing DNA from those samples, and entering the DNA results in a brand new DNA bank. With recent advances in forensic science, law enforcement would run DNA evidence collected from crime scenes through that DNA databank to see if any inmates were connected to unsolved crimes. And in 1999, not only would the Laboratory Corporation of America run DNA tests that would clear Ron and Dennis of any involvement in Debbie's murder, they also ran tests against the Oklahoma Prison DNA Databank that would identify Debbie's real killer. When Ada law enforcement were informed about the results of those tests, not only would Ron and Dennis be set free, but District Attorney Bill Peterson would have to prepare for a new murder trial and build a case against his own former star witness who had helped wrongfully convict Ron and Dennis 11 years earlier. But before police could charge their new suspect in the 1982 murder of Debbie Carter, this case took one more unbelievable twist. Around noon on the day that Ron and Dennis finally walked out of prison as free men and drew their first breath of cool and fresh Oklahoma spring air, Debbie's killer quietly slipped away from his prison work detail in the town of Purcell, 50 miles north of Ada. Pulling off his prison work shirt, Debbie's old school classmate, Glenn Gore, the same Glenn Gore who had been the first to go to Ada police and give them his testimony and say, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe this happened to Debbie, who would do this to her," that Glenn Gore melted into the nearby woods close to the ditch he had been cleaning, and when police arrived at the Lexington prison where he was serving his 40-year sentence, they found that Glenn had escaped. 6 days later, Glenn turned himself in on condition that his return to prison would not be handled by Ada law enforcement. In the days and weeks that followed the release of Ron and Dennis, Detective Smith and District Attorney Bill Peterson would be completely discredited in the local, state, and national press for their mishandling of Debbie's murder investigation. It would take 2 trials, but on June 24, 2006, 45-year-old Glenn Gore would be convicted of first-degree murder in the 1982 death of then 21-year-old Deborah Carter, and he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ron Williamson never recovered from his ordeal in prison and on death row. Although he and Dennis both received an undisclosed amount of money in damages for their wrongful conviction, Ron's mental and physical health just kept getting worse. After giving most of his money away, Ron died in a nursing home in December 2004. He was only 51 years old. Dennis Fritz would return to Kansas City, where he would go back to teaching school and living with his daughter, but in 2016, he would suffer a debilitating head injury in a car accident. Detective Dennis Smith would die of a sudden, unexpected heart attack in June of 2006, just weeks after being called to testify in Glenn Gore's murder trial. In 2014, Debbie's mother, Peggy Stillwell, would write a letter to Glenn Gore begging him to tell her why he killed her daughter. Unfortunately, Glenn never wrote back. Thanks to author John Grisham, whose 2006 nonfiction account of the story, The Innocent Man, was an invaluable source of information in creating this episode. Please see our source list for links to other related material. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the 5-star review button's lip balm with superglue. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's episode is a fan favorite. It's called These People Actually Exist, and it's actually one of our very first episodes from back when we started this podcast. The audio from the story has been remastered. There is a very particular type of criminal that's often portrayed in horror movies, but who rarely exists in real life. However, as rare as these people are, they do actually exist, and when they decide to wreak havoc, there's often very little anyone can do to stop them. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask if you can borrow the Amazon Music Follow Button's phone just to make a quick call, but instead just log onto their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1992, 18-year-old Danita Gillette finished up her shift at Rally's, a fast food hamburger restaurant in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She hung up her apron, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and then she stepped outside into the freezing 19-degree night air. Danita had not driven a car to work that day, so she pulled her plaid flannel jacket tightly around her to keep warm, and then she began to briskly walk in the direction of her mother's house, which was only a couple of miles away. That night, like every other Christmas Eve night, Danita's family had all gathered up at her mother's house to celebrate. The Gillettes were one of those big families that were very close and who always looked out for each other. When Danita had gotten pregnant when she was only 15 years old, she had told her parents and 7 siblings, all of whom were older than her, that she'd likely have to drop out of school and get a full-time job to provide for this child. But her family's reaction was, nonsense. We'll help you raise this baby so you can stay in school and get a good job and still have a great life. And sure enough, from the moment Danita gave birth to her daughter, her entire family stepped up and made themselves available to provide childcare anytime she needed them to. Fast forward a couple of years back to that Christmas Eve night in 1992, and since Danita had to work that shift at Rally's, her daughter, who was now 2 years old, had been spending the night with her family at her mother's house. And so as Danita walked, she suddenly had this urge to call her family and just check in to make sure her daughter was okay, and also just to give them a heads up that she would be there in the next 30 minutes or so. So at around 10 p.m., she stopped at a payphone on the side of the road that was only about a half mile from the Rally's restaurant. She fished some coins out of her pocket, she put them into the slot on the phone, and then she dialed her mother's phone number. As the phone rang, Danita likely was thinking about how much fun it was going to be to see everyone that night. She also likely was looking forward to eating some of her mother's famous chili and cornbread that she always made around this time of the year. At Danita's mother's house, her whole family was sitting around in the living room chatting and having a nice time, just waiting for Danita to arrive. At 10 p.m., when the phone rang in the house, immediately everyone in Danita's family assumed it had to be Danita calling to let them know that she was off work and that she would be home soon. So when the phone was ringing, one of Danita's siblings, Rhonda, she jumped up and she excitedly ran into the kitchen and she pulled the phone off the receiver and she said, "Hello?" expecting to hear her sister's very happy voice on the other end of the line, but instead she heard silence. Rhonda said, "Hello?" a few more times, but when she was still met with silence, She shrugged and put the receiver back into its cradle, and then she walked back into the living room and she told her family that no, it was not Danita, it must have been a wrong number. Danita's family would stay up for a little while longer waiting for Danita, but she never showed up, and they never actually spoke to her on the phone. Eventually, the family was so tired they decided to just go to bed for the night. They figured Danita must have gotten hung up at work, which was prone to happen, and so they would just have to wait until the next morning to celebrate the holidays with her. Around the time Danita stepped outside of the Rally's restaurant and began making her walk to her mother's house, Dayton, Ohio homicide detective Doyle Burke was finishing Christmas Eve dinner at his grandmother's house in the suburbs with his wife and their 2 young children. Like the Galettes, the Burkes also liked to get together with family on Christmas Eve at Grandma's. But much as Detective Burke enjoyed the holidays, he'd been a homicide cop long enough to know that just about every week, at least one person got murdered in Dayton. And so chances were good at some point over the next couple of days, he'd be called into work. And sure enough, that Christmas Eve night after they were done eating, his pager went off and he looked at the incoming code and it said, "Call work immediately." When he looked up from his pager, he noticed his wife was staring at him. She knew the drill. She knew he would have to leave. When Detective Burke stepped away to call into work, he was told there had been a shooting on Neal Avenue. The victim had been found near a payphone located about a half-mile away from the Rally's restaurant. Detective Burke said goodbye to his family, he hopped in his car, and he headed over to Neal Avenue. When he got there, he saw a ring of police cars and medical personnel all standing in a circle around this payphone. Burke parked his car on a side street, and then he walked over. And when he pushed past the ring of people, he saw the victim on the sidewalk right underneath the payphone. It was a young woman lying in a pool of her own frozen blood. It was Danita Galette. She had been shot 5 times at point-blank range, bullets striking her in the chest, the legs, and the hands. The pattern of wounds on her body suggested she'd tried to shield herself from the bullets, holding up her hands and turning her head away and crouching back like she was trying not to get hit. After she was lying on the ground, either dying or dead, whoever had attacked her ripped her plaid coat off, they took her sneakers off, and they took her backpack that contained only 50 cents. Scattered around her body were .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, which immediately stood out to Burke. That type of ammunition was distinctive. It was generally only used for target shooting because it was not a very powerful ammunition. However, obviously, it was still lethal at close range. Witnesses in the area said they had heard the shots ring out and then saw 2 young men carrying pistols running away from the payphone. Shortly after Danita's family had decided to just go to bed and see Danita in the morning, they heard a knock on the front door. It was Detective Burke telling them that their Danita had been murdered. They were beyond devastated. They couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to harm Danita. She was such a happy person who everyone seemed to love. They just couldn't understand who would do this. When Burke told the family that Danita had been killed near a payphone, and according to witnesses, her murder likely happened sometime around 10 p.m., as soon as the family heard this, they all thought of that strange, silent phone call that Rhonda had answered around 10 p.m. that night. Had that actually been Danita? Had that been her killer? They didn't know, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would get a call at the same time that she was killed. After leaving the Galette's household and filing his report on Danita's murder, Detective Burke arrived back at his home just hours before dawn on December 25th. After catching a quick nap, he spent that morning with his family celebrating Christmas, but his heart just wasn't in it. He had been investigating homicides for years, and so over time he had become somewhat desensitized to all of the violence. However, that morning he just kept thinking of Danita Galette's grief-stricken family when he had told them the news. He also kept thinking about Danita herself, how scared she must have been when she was crouched down trying to shield herself from her attacker. Her family had shown Burke a picture of Danita when she was alive, And she looked like such a vibrant, happy young woman with this big, infectious smile. It just didn't make any sense that someone would kill her over some shoes and a jacket and a backpack with 50 cents in it. Was this actually a personal attack where they knew who Danita was and they were targeting her, and then afterwards they kind of set it up to look like a robbery? Or was this really a robbery? In which case, again, why are you killing someone over things that are worth so little? Burke kept finding himself thinking in circles about her case. He felt like there had to be more to this than met the eye. And he would be right. That night, just before 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, Burke's pager went off again. There had been another murder. This one had taken place in the northern part of Dayton, roughly 2.5 miles from where Danita had been found. The victim was 19-year-old Richmond Maddox. He was found slumped in the driver's seat of a blue Chevy Caprice that had crashed into a tree on the side of the road. But the crash hadn't killed him. What had killed him was a gunshot wound to the right side of his head, fired from point-blank range. And they searched the car. There was no weapon inside of the car, so this was not a suicide. And they checked the exterior of the car, and there was no entry point into the car from a bullet, which means the gun that shot him had been fired from inside the car. Likely, whoever was sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat had shot this guy in the head. And considering the car had crashed into a tree, indicates that whoever did this, whoever pulled the trigger, had done it while Richmond was actively driving the car. And so in Burke's mind, this indicated that the person who did this had been forced to do this, because it's extremely dangerous to shoot the driver of the vehicle when the car is still moving, because you're going to crash. And so this person who shot Richmond must have been desperate. Maybe they had been kidnapped by Richmond and they were forced to do this. Burke didn't know, but that seemed like the most logical theory. When police spoke to witnesses in the area, they told the police that they heard the crash and then they looked outside and they saw what looked like a short young woman, probably a teenager, get up from the ground near the car and then start running away with a limp. Even though no shell casings were found in or around Richmond's car that could, in theory, link his murder to Danita's murder, Burke still had a hunch that these two murders had to be connected. They had occurred less than 24 hours apart, so back to back, and the bodies were found less than a couple miles apart. And in Burke's experience working in homicide, coincidences rarely occurred. Things happen for a reason. And in Burke's mind, he's thinking, these murders are connected. I just got to figure out what the connection is. But Detective Burke's investigation into Richmond Maddox's death only seemed to further complicate things. Richmond's family, who were stunned at the news of his murder, had no idea who would want to kill him, or who the girl fleeing the scene could possibly be. The only girl in Richmond's life that the family could think of that might have been in the car with him was his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Laura Taylor, who they described as being very sweet and polite. But when Burke went to Laura Taylor's house on the morning of December 26th to interview Laura, he was in for a shock. Laura had apparently not been home in several days, and her parents were very worried. Hearing that their daughter's ex-boyfriend had been killed, they feared the worst, that something terrible had also happened to Laura. But before Detective Burke could even begin to process this new information, that now, in addition to two strange murders, he also now had a missing juvenile, who very well could be the key to solving what was happening. Unbelievably, while he's thinking about all these different things, Burke felt his pager vibrate again. There had been another shooting. This time inside of a mini-market convenience store that was only 3.5 miles south of where Richmond Maddox had been found. This time, there were two victims. Both were still alive, but they were in critical condition. 38-year-old Sarah Abraham was a classic American success story. After immigrating to the United States from war-torn Ethiopia, she and her family worked hard and established businesses in the Dayton area that included a restaurant and a few convenience stores. The convenience store where this shooting took place was the location where Sarah spent the majority of her time. On the day after Christmas, while Detective Burke was speaking to Laura Taylor's family, Sarah Abraham said goodbye to her 3 young children and then headed out the door to go open the convenience store for the day. Once she arrived and she opened the store and went inside, a 71-year-old regular named Jimmy Thompson came in and he stood by the register to chat with her about the holidays. And then at some point, a middle-aged man named Jones Pettis came inside as well, and he began browsing down one of the aisles. A few minutes later, a teenage girl came up to the register and tried to buy a pack of gum, but she was 5 cents short. Jimmy cheerfully reached into his pocket and gave her a nickel. She smiled, took the nickel, put it on the counter, and then she took the gum and walked out of the store. Then, a few minutes after the girl had left, 2 young men entered the store, each holding a pistol. Sarah and Jimmy immediately threw their hands up over their head, and Sarah told the gunman, take anything you want. We'll give you all the money we have. Please just don't shoot us. One of the men barked at her to open the cash register and give them all of her money. And so with shaking hands, Sarah reached down and she opened the register. She pulled all the money out. She gave it to them, and then she kept her hands up. She had given them everything they had wanted. But for some reason, the man who had taken the money from her still raised his pistol up. He put it right in her face and he fired 2 shots. One went straight through her mouth and the other went through the top of her head. And then, after she collapsed to the ground, the men began shooting at Jimmy, but amazingly, they missed him despite being right in front of him. And Jimmy, who was thinking on his feet, immediately threw himself kind of over the counter and acted like he had been mortally wounded. And so the gunmen, believing Jimmy was down as well, they turned around and they began walking out of the store. But as they were leaving, they noticed Jones Pettis, who was trying to hide at the end of one of the aisles. And so they just fired at him, striking him in the hand and in the stomach. Then the 2 gunmen left, they hopped in a car, and they fled. Paramedics would rush Sarah Abraham and Jones Pettis to the hospital. Jones would survive, but Sarah would die from her injuries 5 days later. When Detective Burke arrived at the convenience store that morning, the other officers who were already on scene told him that Jimmy and Jones had not gotten a good look at the shooters. They just said that they were 2 young men and that they didn't recognize them. After being told this information, Burke stepped inside of the convenience store to have a look around. He was already operating on the idea that this attack had to be linked to Richmond Maddox and to Danita Gillette, because again, the proximity and time to the other murders was just too much to overlook. That couldn't be a coincidence. And sure enough, right as Burke stepped into the store, this hunch of his seemed to be confirmed, because on the blood-stained ground near the counter were several .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, the same distinctive ammunition type that was used in Danita's murder. At this point, Burke was fully convinced these murders had to be linked. But the victims didn't make sense. It would turn out none of the victims' families had ever heard of the other victims or their families. None of the victims worked together or went to school together or had any interaction at all. It just seemed like the victims were kind of random. But as Burke and his partners were discussing how these crimes could be linked, Burke got yet another call. There had just been an attempted shooting at a Dayton gas station. When Burke arrived, they found this hysterical woman named Kathy Henderson, who earlier had been putting air in the tires of her black 1989 Dodge Shadow. When 2 young men pull into the parking lot, they hop out of the car and they walk right up to her. They raise their guns at her, and then one of them says, "You're gonna die today." And then the 2 men just started shooting at her. And amazingly, she managed to not get shot and she was able to run to safety, but the 2 men stole her car. The bullet casings that were found at the scene of this crime were, unsurprisingly, the same distinctive aluminum variety. Clearly, whoever was behind all of these shootings was not showing any signs of slowing down. And so by now, these shootings in Dayton had attracted so much attention that it was not only all over the local media, but it was all over the national media. This was all anybody in the country was talking about, that there was just these rogue people running around Dayton shooting random people, and the police apparently couldn't stop them. And so panic was spreading like a wave amongst Dayton residents and surrounding areas. It didn't seem to matter who you were or what you were doing. Suddenly, everyone felt like they could be next. On the evening of December 26th, shortly after Kathy Henderson's carjacking was reported, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was in his patrol car cruising the northwest neighborhood of Dayton when an all-points bulletin came across his radio. The dispatcher said to be on the lookout for the 1989 Dodge Shadow that Kathy Henderson had stolen, and that if they found it, be advised because the occupants were likely the same people perpetrating all of these shootings all over town, and so they were likely armed and dangerous. Huber had developed a knack for finding stolen cars in Dayton. He knew where all the little cutouts were and back alleys were where people like to stash their stolen cars, and so he decided he would just go looking for the Dodge Shadow. And after only being on the hunt for about 20 minutes, he looked down a dark, quiet street just a mile away from where Danita had been killed, and he saw a black Dodge Shadow parked on the side of the road. When he drove up behind it, he saw it was empty, so he called the police station and asked them to run the license plates. And when they called him back, they told him that the plates did not belong to a black Dodge Shadow. They belonged to a blue Pontiac Grand Am, and that the Grand Am was registered to a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson. Sergeant Huber was confused and thought maybe he had given them the wrong plates, but then he noticed, parked a little ways down the road ahead of the Dodge Shadow, was a blue Pontiac Grand Am. And so on a hunch, Huber drove forward and he took down the Grand Am's license plates and he called back into the police station and he asked them to run those. And they would come back and they would say, well, it turns out the plates on the Grand Am are the plates that should be on Kathy Henderson's Dodge Shadow. Meaning, clearly, in an effort to cover their trail, the suspects had switched the license plates between these two cars. And so naturally, Sergeant Huber picked up his radio and he asked if Joseph Wilkerson had reported his car as stolen. And after a few moments, the radio crackled back from headquarters that no, Joseph Wilkerson had not reported this car stolen. So Huber immediately became very suspicious of this Joseph Wilkerson person and told headquarters they should really send someone over to Joseph's property to talk to him, since most likely he was either one of the shooters or was involved in some way with all of these shootings. Huber said he would stay put on this road and he would stake out these two vehicles and wait to see if anyone came back to claim them. Detective Burke and his team were the ones dispatched to go check out the Wilkerson property. It was a small single-floor white house that was located only about 2.5 miles from where Danita had been killed. Burke opened the front gate that surrounded the property and he walked along the pathway up onto the front porch and he knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Burke called out that, hey, it's police, you gotta open up, but there was silence in the house. Burke left the porch and walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door, but still no one came to the door. However, as Burke and his team stood around the back of the house, they all started to smell something awful. It was this putrid smell that was definitely coming from inside the house. They didn't know what the smell was, but given the circumstances and frankly the urgency to figure out who is behind all these shootings, they decided this smell constituted potential foul play, and so they kicked in the back door and they made entry into the house. Immediately, the smell picked up tenfold. It smelled absolutely horrible inside this house. And just from a quick glance around the inside, it was very obvious this house had been ransacked. Somebody had robbed this house. All the drawers and cabinets had been opened. There was trash and clothing and random pieces of electronics all over the ground. And so the police, they have their guns out. They're scanning around the room and they're yelling out, "Police, if you're here, show yourself. We're coming in." But no one showed themselves. It was all silent in the house. And so the police began carefully stepping through the house, and they eventually turned right and began walking down this one central hallway that seemed to lead to kind of a back room that looked like maybe a bedroom at the end of the hall. And as they're walking down this hallway, the smell is getting stronger and stronger. And then finally they get to the end of this hallway and they look into this room, and they can see what is causing the smell. There on the bed in this room was 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson. His wrists and his ankles had been tied to the 4 posters of the bed with electrical wire, kind of putting him in a spread eagle position on his back. He had no clothes on, but he had a pillow over his chest and his head, and on the outside, on the top of the pillow, were 2 obvious scorch marks. Someone had clearly pressed a gun into that pillow and then fired 2 shots through it into Joseph's chest and his head, killing him. And from the look of his body and the smell, Wilkerson had likely been dead for at least several days. Also on the ground was another aluminum shell casing, meaning almost certainly this murder was connected to all the others. But the police still had no clue who their attackers were. Who were these mysterious 2 young men? Who was this young girl who jumped out of that car? Was that Laura Taylor? Was that the ex-girlfriend? Was she kidnapped? They didn't know. None of it made any sense. Who were the victims? They don't know each other. Why are they being chosen? What is the connection? And so because the police were kind of at a dead end and they really didn't know where to take this case, they set up a tip line that night for people in Dayton and outside of Dayton to call in with any information about any of these shooting victims. And over the first couple of hours that this tip line was established, the callers that were calling in were providing nothing of value. But late that night on the 26th, a call came through from an 18-year-old named Nicholas Woodson. And based on the tone of his voice, it was obvious he was genuinely scared for his life. He told police that he thought he was going to be the next Dayton murder victim. When police asked him why, he said, "Because I know who the killers are. There's 4 of them, and I think they're planning to kill me next to keep me from talking to you." While the police spoke with Nicholas, Sergeant Huber was still hiding out in his patrol car, watching the Dodge Shadow and the Pontiac Grand Am from a distance. He was kind of hidden behind some trees. And at some point, he saw movement in an apartment building situated just opposite where these 2 vehicles were parked. 3 young people walked out of the building. They walked down the front steps out onto the road. And as they crossed over the road towards the 2 vehicles, they were illuminated by the streetlight, and Huber could clearly see there were 2 young men and a small young woman. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the Dodge Shadow, while the other 2 climbed into the passenger and back seat of the Shadow. As the driver turned the Shadow on and pulled away from the curb, Huber radioed into headquarters that the vehicle was on the move and he needed backup right away, and then he too pulled away from the curb and began following them. After just 2 blocks, the Shadow stopped, and at that moment, Sergeant Huber sped up behind them with his lights on. And immediately, the passenger door of the Shadow flew open, and one of the 2 men took off running. But the other man and the woman stayed in the vehicle. Huber's backup had not arrived yet, so he couldn't worry about the runner. Instead, he stepped out of his car and stood behind his open car door to kind of use it as a shield, and he aimed his pistol at the driver and he yelled for them not to move. Inside the Dodge, the interior light was now on, and it showed the man was still sitting in the driver's seat, not really doing anything, and the young woman who was in the car, who was in the back seat, she was becoming hysterical, and she was screaming at the driver to shoot him now, shoot him now! But the driver didn't do anything. And then moments later, backup arrived, and they were able to pull the man and the woman out of the Dodge without a fight, and they arrested them both. They were 19-year-old Marvalis Keene, and the young woman was none other than 16-year-old Laura Taylor, the ex-girlfriend of Richmond Maddox, whose family had reported her missing. The police searched the nearby buildings for the man who had run, and they quickly found him. He had gone back inside the apartment building that Sergeant Huber had originally seen the trio come out of before they got into the Dodge Shadow. The runner was 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and with him in the building he was attempting to hide inside of was 20-year-old Heather Matthews, and she was actively trying to hide DeMarcus. And so both of them were arrested as well. When all 4 of them were brought back to the station, the police noticed that Marvalis was wearing Danita's flannel jacket and DeMarcus was wearing Danita's sneakers. Additionally, while these 4 were being processed at the police station, A call came in from a team of police investigators who were searching the Dodge Shadow, and they would say that they recovered 2 guns, a .32 caliber Derringer pistol and a .25 caliber pistol that contained the same distinctive aluminum ammunition that was used in almost all of the murders. The police had just caught their killers, and they would soon find out they had done a lot more damage than the public was aware of. The police would interrogate all 4 of them that night, starting with Laura Taylor, who they thought would be the easiest to get information from because she was 16, so she was the youngest, and she was considered to be very kind and thoughtful. But Laura would remain silent for the entire long interrogation, and when she was asked at some point if she wanted to take a break to go use the restroom, she just stood up and urinated directly onto the floor and then sat back down again in silence. But Laura was the only one who acted tough. The other 3 talked, and before long, the police heard the whole awful story of what they had done. It all started back on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Laura, Heather, and MrBallen were sitting around together talking about how they needed money. And at some point, Laura suggested they rob a guy she knew, Joseph Wilkerson. She said he probably had lots of nice things in his house, and I know he has a car, so we can take all of that. The other 2 liked the idea, and so Laura called Joseph and asked him if he wanted to be a part of an orgy with them. And Joseph said yes. So the trio walked over to Joseph's house, he let them in, and then the 2 girls and Joseph walked back into that back bedroom while MrBallen sat on the couch in the living room. In the bedroom, Joseph laid on the bed and he took his clothes off, and Heather and Laura pretended to start taking their clothes off when suddenly MrBallen, as planned, came bursting into the room with his pistol held out in front of him. He aimed it at Joseph and told him not to move, and then he ordered Heather and Laura to tie Joseph's hands and ankles to the 4 posters of the bed. Joseph immediately begins to beg for his life and tells them they can take anything they want in the house. Anything in this house, it's yours, just please don't shoot me. MrBallen instructed the girls to go search his house for valuables. And so while MrBallen is standing there with the gun aimed at Joseph, perhaps in an attempt to kind of bargain his way out of this, says to MrBallen, hey, I have a really amazing gun, a .32 caliber Derringer that I have hidden in the garage. If you want it, I can tell you where it is. And so MrBallen was totally interested, and he said, yeah, tell me where it is. And so Joseph explained where to go in the garage, and so MrBallen left the room, he went into the garage, and he would eventually find this little gun, this .32 caliber gun. And then when MrBallen walked back into the bedroom with Joseph, he promptly walked over to Joseph, grabbed a pillow, he put it over Joseph's chest. Joseph is just looking up at him, wondering what he's doing. And then MrBallen took this new gun, this .32 caliber Derringer, and he pushed it into the pillow so it was aiming straight down at Joseph's body. Joseph pleaded with him not to shoot him, but MrBallen pulled the trigger and he fired a shot through the pillow into Joseph's chest. Joseph began screaming, and then he made this guttural sound and his whole body began to shake. And so the other 2 girls, they heard the sound of the shot, so they came running back into the bedroom. And when they saw what was happening, they just stood there. And then Laura looked over at MrBallen and said, hey, can I shoot him too? And MrBallen says, sure. And he hands her the .32 caliber Derringer, the one they had taken from the garage. And Laura takes the gun. She walks over to the still shaking Wilkerson. She repositions the pillow on his face. She pushes the Derringer into the pillow, aiming right at Joseph's face. And then she pulls the trigger. But it doesn't fire. And so frustrated, she turns away from Wilkerson, who's still making all sorts of noise. He's still shaking. And she walks over to MrBallen and says, let me use your gun. And so MrBallen pulls out a .25 caliber gun. It was his gun. It was the gun that used aluminum shell casing rounds. And he hands it to Laura. And so Laura hands him the Derringer. She takes the .25 caliber. And then she walks right next to Joseph again. She grabs the pillow and makes sure it's flush to his face. She puts the .25 caliber gun up against the pillow, aiming it right at Joseph's face. And then she pulls the trigger. This time the gun would fire, and as soon as it did, Joseph's body stopped shaking and he went limp. As the trio stood there staring at Joseph Wilkerson's lifeless body, they all realized something. killing was actually quite fun. The trio left the bedroom and began eating Wilkerson's food and watching his TV and looking for things to steal, all the while happily talking about how amazing the killing experience had just been. Eventually, though, their killing high had worn off, and they realized that Wilkerson did not have any cash in the house, and really, he didn't have nice stuff in his house, so they couldn't really even sell very much of it for very much money. And so they decided they needed to go rob somebody else to get the money they needed. But first, they recruited another friend of theirs, DeMarcus Smith, to come over and join them. When DeMarcus arrived, he, along with Laura and Marvalis, left Wilkerson's house, leaving Heather behind to watch over the place. The trio walked away from the house towards town, keeping an eye out for anyone who was out alone and could potentially be an easy target to mug. And eventually, around 10 p.m., they spotted a young woman they didn't know standing near a payphone. It was Danita, and she was fishing coins out of her pocket to put into the phone. By the time Danita had finished dialing the number of her mother's house, she heard the sound of Marvalis and DeMarcus come running up behind her, and when she turned around, she saw they had guns pointing at her, so she dropped the phone. Then the two men demanded she give them her shoes, which she instantly did. But then, simply because he thought it would be fun, Marvalis still just started shooting her. So he shot Danita 4 times, and then DeMarcus, who had not been a part of the Wilkerson killing, just immediately joined in, and he shot her a 5th time. After she was laying on the ground, dead or dying, the two men yanked her plaid jacket and her backpack off, and then they ran back to Laura on the other side of the road, and the trio retreated back to the Wilkerson house. When Danita's sister, Rhonda, picked up that phone call around 10 p.m. and was met with silence, that really had been her sister Danita calling. But Danita had died literally seconds before the line had connected. Even though, once again, their robbery target did not yield them very much in terms of monetary value, the friends felt like this second murder was still a really good thing. It was a turning point for them. They felt invincible. Killing was the best high that any of them had ever experienced. So in some ways, it didn't matter that they weren't making any money out of these robberies. It was the killing part they liked. To celebrate their murders, the 4 friends threw a party that night at Wilkerson's house. So Wilkerson's dead body is just literally decomposing in the bedroom. They just shut the door during this party. One of the people who showed up to this party was Jeffrey Wright, one of Heather's former boyfriends. And at some point in the night, Heather and Jeffrey got into this huge argument, and Jeffrey grabbed Heather by the hair and started dragging her into a back room. And so, drawn by the commotion of this, Marvalis burst into the room after them and chased Jeffrey, who leapt out of a window. Marvalis jumped out of the window after him and then began shooting at him, hitting Jeffrey 4 times in the legs as he ran away. Miraculously, Jeffrey would make it to a hospital and he would survive, though he would not go to police and tell them what happened. Seeing Heather's ex-boyfriend get shot excited Laura, and she decided she wanted to shoot her ex-boyfriend too. So the next day, on Christmas, Laura called up Richmond Maddox and asked him if he wanted to have sex with her at a nearby motel. When he said yes, she told him he would have to pay for the motel, so bring cash. Richmond agreed, and when he arrived at the designated meeting place that day, Laura climbed into the front passenger seat next to him, knowing full well she was going to kill him and steal the money out of his wallet first chance she got. But after they took off, Richmond looked in his rearview mirror and he saw Marvalis and DeMarcus following them in a car. Sensing this was a setup, Richmond hit the gas, and without any hesitation, Laura pulled out the .32 caliber Derringer pistol they had stolen from Wilkerson. She placed it against Richmond's right temple and she fired. Then she threw herself out of the moving car right before it crashed into the tree. Marvalis and DeMarcus would swing by and pick her up a little ways down the road, and then the trio would head back to their base of operations, the Wilkerson house. At this point, the foursome had killed 3 people and nearly killed a 4th. But while they were very pleased with this, they still hadn't managed to take anything of real value from any of their victims, And realistically, even though the killing was fun, they did need cash. They had no money. So the next morning on December 26th, Laura, Marvalis, DeMarcus, and Heather decided they would rob a convenience store. So they pulled up in front of Sarah Abraham's store, and while Heather, DeMarcus, and Marvalis waited outside in the car, Laura went in to scope the place out. After going inside and counting how many people were in there, although she counted wrong, she walked up to the counter to buy gum, but she was a nickel short. However, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson gave her the nickel she needed, and so she bought the gum, she smiled, and she made her way out. When she walked back outside, she hopped into the car, and she told DeMarcus and Marvalis that it was just two people inside, a cashier and the man who had given her a nickel. She had not seen Jones Pettis, who was at the end of one of the aisles. So DeMarcus and Marvalis go inside the shop, and they hold Sarah and Jimmy at gunpoint, and after getting all the cash out of the cash register, which was only $40, the urge to kill became too much for Marvalis to control. And so he raised his gun, he aimed it at Sarah, and he shot her in the face. DeMarcus would attempt to shoot Jimmy, but he would miss. And then the pair, on their way out, would notice Jones at the end of the aisle, and even though he posed absolutely no threat to them, they shot at him anyways. After Heather drove them away from the convenience store, they stopped at a gas station for reasons we don't really know, at which point DeMarcus and Marvalis, they see this woman, Kathy Henderson, who's just completely minding her own business. She's putting air in her Dodge Shadows tires, and they decide they're going to kill her too. So they hop out of the car, they walk over to her, and Marvalis literally says to her, "You're going to die today," and then he raises his gun and he begins shooting at her, as does DeMarcus. But amazingly, they miss her, and so she gets away, she does not get shot, and then they just steal her car. Even though by now, the foursome had left behind an astounding amount of evidence that 100% was going to get them caught eventually. Despite that, their only fear at this time was that two of their friends, 18-year-old Marvin Washington and 16-year-old Wendy Cottrill, might snitch and turn them in. Marvin and Wendy had been present at that big party at the Wilkersons' house and had overheard the foursome talking about the murders. And the foursome knew they had overheard. But strangely, Wendy and Marvin were not the only people at that party who had overheard them. 18-year-old Nicholas Woodson was also at this party, and he overheard, and they knew he overheard. But for some reason, the foursome had identified Marvin and Wendy as the most likely to snitch. And so Marvalis confronted the pair about this, and he told them they would have to come along for the next murder to prove their loyalty and trustworthiness. And Wendy and Marvin agreed. And so that night on December 26th, Marvalis and DeMarcus drove Marvin and Wendy out to the edge of town to this gravel pit. And when they got there and parked the car, Wendy and Marvin realized they were the next murder victims. They pleaded with Marvalis to let them go, that they wouldn't say anything, they promised, but he wasn't having it. Marvin eventually got out of the car and DeMarcus followed, and DeMarcus told Marvin to get on his knees, which he did, and then DeMarcus shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And so Wendy has seen this happen, so she knows she's next, and she begins screaming and begging for her life, and she grabs onto the inside of the car so as not to get pulled out. But DeMarcus comes back over to the car, he grabs her and starts pulling on her, and then Marvalis as well comes around and he grabs onto her too. And between the two of them, they're able to pull Wendy out of the car, at which point Marvalis told her to open her mouth. And eventually she would, and Marvalis put the pistol, the .25 caliber pistol, into her mouth, and he told her to bite the barrel. And then when she was biting the barrel, he pulled the trigger. The killers left the bodies where they fell and just hopped back in their car and headed back into town. Nicholas Woodson likely knew that Marvin and Wendy had just been killed for snitching. And so he's thinking to himself, I overheard them talking about the murders. What's stopping Marvalis and DeMarcus from killing me next? I know about the murders, and they know that. And so that was the point at which Nicholas would call the tip line and he would say, I know who the killers are. It's these 4 people. And literally, practically at the exact same time that Nicholas was giving this tip, Sergeant Huber had spotted Marvalis and DeMarcus and Laura getting into the Dodge Shadow, which would lead to their arrest as well as Heather Matthews' arrest. After going to trial a year later, Laura Taylor, Heather Matthews, and DeMarcus Smith would all receive life sentences. As for Marvalis Keene, who was effectively the ringleader of the foursome, he would be sentenced to death. His execution was carried out on July 21st, 2009. He died by lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.